Beneath the jagged peaks and frozen passes of the Himalayas, mysteries linger that defy explanation, whispering through windswept valleys and echoing across silent, snow-covered ridges. From shadowy figures gliding over frozen lakes, to glowing orbs drifting along remote river valleys, and from kingdoms that vanished without a trace to ancient scripts hidden in cliffside caves, the mountains conceal secrets that challenge both reason and history. In this journey through the highlands, we trace the unexplained heat of sacred springs, investigate the guidance of invisible companions in the thin air, and examine remnants of civilizations whose knowledge surpasses what we thought possible. Each phenomenon opens a window into a world where the impossible brushes against reality, where the line between science, legend, and the unknown blurs, inviting exploration and demanding careful attention. The skeletons of Roopkund Lake, India. High in the Indian Himalayas, nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, lies a glacial basin so desolate and still that even the wind seems to hesitate before crossing its rim. Roopkund Lake is small, barely 40 metres across, yet it holds within its frozen waters one of the most perplexing archaeological enigmas ever uncovered in South Asia. For much of the year, the lake remains sealed beneath ice, appearing as nothing more than a mirror of glass encircled by cliffs and snowfields. But when the sun returns and the thaw begins, the ice gives way to a grim revelation. Hundreds of human skeletons, their bones scattered and pale against the dark rock, preserved by altitude and cold as if the mountain itself refused to let them decay. The first recorded discovery came in the 1940s, when a British forest ranger named Hari Kishan Madwal stumbled upon the grisly site during a patrol. He reported a shoreline littered with skulls and ribs, their polished surfaces glinting like ivory beneath the melting snow. Initial guesses were as varied as they were uncertain. Some believed the remains belonged to Japanese soldiers attempting to infiltrate India during World War II, others imagined victims of ritual sacrifice, ancient traders, or even a lost Himalayan army. The truth, however, was not so easily contained. When later expeditions counted the bones, they found the remains of more than 300 people, all remarkably well preserved by the cold, their relics still lying where they fell. The mystery deepened with each attempt to study it. Early radiocarbon dating placed the deaths around the 9th century, long before any military conflict in the region. Among the skeletons were fragments of leather shoes, wooden rings, spears and iron bangles. Some remains still bore remnants of flesh and hair, while others rested in perfect articulation, as though death had come swiftly. The surrounding terrain offered no sign of settlement or battle, and the lake's isolation made it difficult to imagine how such a multitude had gathered there. Roopkund sits on the pilgrimage route to Nanda Devi, and so scholars speculated that the dead might have been devotees travelling through the mountains when disaster struck. Yet no written record described a tragedy of such scale. When anthropologists began to examine the bones in detail, the story grew stranger still. Nearly all of the skulls showed identical injuries, small, round depressions at the top of the cranium, consistent with blunt force trauma delivered from above. There were no wounds to the rest of the body, no signs of struggle or defence. It was as if something had fallen upon them from the sky. Researchers proposed an extraordinary possibility, that a sudden storm of massive hailstones, some as large as cricket balls, had descended on the group without warning, killing them instantly. The high valley offers little shelter, and such an event could easily turn fatal at altitude. For a time this explanation held sway, and Roopkund was declared the site of an ancient catastrophe caused by the very mountain weather that still prowls its heights. But science rarely rests where certainty seems convenient. Decades later, a new genetic study shattered the neat simplicity of the hailstorm theory. DNA extracted from the bones revealed not one population but several, some individuals of South Asian descent, others with genetic profiles linked to the Eastern Mediterranean. Even more puzzling, the analysis showed that the deaths had occurred not in a single event, but across multiple centuries. Some skeletons dated back to around 800 CE, while others appeared as recent as the 19th century. The possibility that pilgrims from Greece or Crete had perished beside Indian travellers, separated by hundreds of years yet buried beneath the same ice, raised questions that no expedition could answer. Archaeologists returned to the site in 2019, bringing new instruments to probe the sediments and glacial deposits around the lake. They found no evidence of landslides, warfare, or disease outbreaks that could explain such recurring tragedy. Even the path leading to Roopkund remains treacherous today, a narrow route threading through meadows and ridges where altitude sickness and sudden storms are constant threats. Those who have made the climb describe an atmosphere of silence that feels heavy, as though sound itself were reluctant to linger. The air is thin and sharp, and every movement seems to echo against the snow. Local folklore adds yet another layer to the mystery. Villagers from nearby Wan and Lohajung speak of the wrath of the goddess Nanda Devi, protector of the region. According to legend, a king once defied her by leading a celebratory procession through her sacred mountains, accompanied by dancers and musicians. Angered by the intrusion, the goddess is said to have sent a storm of stones and ice from the heavens, striking the revelers where they stood. For centuries, the people of the region treated Roopkund as a cursed place, a reminder of divine punishment for human arrogance. When later expeditions unearthed the skulls marked by impact from above, the old story seemed to rise again from myth into uneasy relevance. Yet even the folklore fails to account for the Mediterranean remains, the genetic anomaly that refuses to fit the pattern of pilgrimage or myth. Some scientists have speculated that later groups, perhaps explorers or traders, stumbled upon the lake long after the original tragedy, only to meet the same fate in an environment that offers little mercy. Others believe Roopkund served as a ritual site, its remoteness protecting it from later disturbance. The dead left intentionally as offerings to the goddess or the mountain itself. But these theories remain speculation. No inscriptions, artifacts, or oral traditions bridge the centuries that separate the deaths, and the bones continue to guard their silence. Every few years, melting ice reveals more remains, bones resurfacing as if stirred by the lake's restless memory. Photographs taken during thaws show skulls perfectly aligned beneath clear water, their empty sockets reflecting the sky. Climbers who have visited describe the feeling of being watched, of standing in a place where time itself feels fractured. The Himalayan wind moves across the surface, lifting small ripples that break against stone ribs, and then the mountain falls silent again. Roopkund Lake remains frozen for most of the year, locked away from easy study. The government has restricted excavation to preserve the site, and so the mystery endures, its victims suspended between myth and science, between what is known and what refuses to be named. In the end, the mountain keeps its own counsel, preserving these strangers beneath its ice, while generations of researchers return with new instruments and leave with the same unanswered questions. And when the sun dips behind the ridges, the lake becomes a mirror again, its frozen depths holding the reflections of those who vanished there, waiting for the next thaw to tell their story. The unclimbed summit of Mount Kailash, Tibet. At the far western edge of the Tibetan plateau, rising in solitary brilliance above the desolate plains of Ngari, stands Mount Kailash, a perfect pyramid of stone and ice that no human has ever reached the top of. From a distance, its symmetry seems too deliberate to be natural, its four sheer faces aligned almost exactly with the cardinal directions, as if carved by unseen design rather than erosion. To the local Tibetans, this mountain is not merely part of the landscape, it is the axis of the world, the cosmic pillar known as Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology, the dwelling of gods, and the turning point of time itself. Travellers who approach its base often speak of an unsettling stillness, a kind of silence that feels sentient, as though the mountain itself is aware of their intrusion. Centuries of pilgrims have circled its base rather than climb its slopes, tracing a 52-kilometre path known as the Kora, believed to cleanse the soul of sins when completed. The devout walk clockwise, while followers of the ancient Bon religion move counterclockwise, each group believing that to step upon the mountain itself would be an act of desecration. Yet even beyond the realm of faith, there is something inexplicable about Kailash's resistance to human ascent. Attempts to study or measure its summit have faltered not from religious opposition alone, but from a peculiar pattern of misfortune that seems to haunt any expedition that gets too close. In 1926, the renowned mountaineer Hugh Rutledge surveyed the region and wrote of Kailash's strange perfection, claiming that to climb it would be a sacrilege against the spirit of the mountain. When later explorers requested permission to attempt the ascent, local lamas firmly refused, insisting that anyone who disturbed their peak would bring catastrophe upon themselves and the world. Decades later, in 1985, a team of Soviet climbers reportedly ignored these warnings and prepared to scale its northern face. They vanished before reaching the upper glacier, and though their disappearance was never confirmed by official record, stories spread that their remains had been found aged beyond recognition, as though time itself had unravelled differently upon that slope. Modern technology has done little to pierce its mystery. Satellite imagery reveals patterns of erosion that form an almost perfect cross across its faces, while glaciologists note that its snowline remains unnaturally stable despite regional climate shifts. To those who study its shape, the precision is uncanny. Its summit forms a near-perfect octahedron, a geometry that mirrors ancient descriptions of cosmic mountains in Vedic and Buddhist texts. Some scholars have speculated that this might explain why so many cultures, separated by centuries and distance, speak of Kailash as the centre of the universe, where heaven and earth converge. Yet even with these observations, the mountain remains untouched, as though nature itself guards its sanctity. Among the myths that encircle Kailash, few are as persistent as the belief that it serves as a gateway, not metaphorically but physically, between worlds. Ancient Tibetan manuscripts speak of hidden passages beneath its base, leading to the fabled city of Shambhala, a realm of eternal knowledge and light. In the 20th century, Russian mystic Nicholas Roerich claimed to have witnessed strange luminous objects near the mountain, which he described as metallic discs gliding silently through the air. Decades later, accounts from Indian and Chinese border patrols would echo similar sightings, hovering lights that appeared without sound, vanishing abruptly into the clouded summit. What makes these accounts more unsettling is their consistency with earlier reports from travellers in the 19th century, who described moments of disorientation and reversed time while trekking near the mountain's shadow. Modern visitors sometimes recount feeling that hours have passed when only minutes have elapsed, or the reverse, that an entire day vanished in what felt like moments. Though scientists attribute these sensations to altitude, magnetic interference, or exhaustion, none have explained the compass anomalies recorded in the region, where instruments are said to spin erratically, defying calibration. Yet not all mysteries surrounding Kailash are supernatural. The mountain lies at the source of 4 of Asia's great rivers, the Indus, Sutlej, Brahmaputra, and Karnali, each flowing in a different direction, as though the world itself radiates from this single point. For centuries, this geographical impossibility has fueled speculation among geologists, who find it extraordinary that so many watersheds emerge from one massif. Even so, every attempt to map the subterranean networks beneath Kailash has ended inconclusively, blocked by rock strata that seem to resist seismic imaging, as though concealing vast caverns or hollows never reached by light. While the mountain's summit has never felt the imprint of human feet, those who walk its circuit describe inexplicable sensations, the sudden scent of incense on barren wind, or the faint echo of bells from within the ice. Some pilgrims speak of dreams in which unseen voices urge them to return, while others claim that their shadows grew longer than the light should allow. Among Buddhist monks, it is said that those who complete 108 koras will transcend the cycle of rebirth entirely, their souls merging with the mountain's eternal stillness. A few who have dedicated their lives to this ritual have vanished during their final circuit, their absence accepted not as loss but as ascension. Attempts to understand Kailash through logic often collapse beneath its contradictions. To physicists, its alignment and magnetic field invite study. To archaeologists, its geometry resembles forgotten monuments. To the faithful, it is the still heart of existence. Yet all agree on one thing: it endures beyond explanation, immune to conquest, untouched by time. Its reflection in nearby Lake Manasaravar appears almost too clear, as if the mountain within the water is more real than the one above it. Even now, those who camp beneath its shadow tell of nights when the air vibrates faintly, as though the mountain hums in its sleep, and the stars above it seem to move in slow, deliberate patterns that no chart can predict. Sherpas whisper that anyone who watches too long risks seeing something they cannot forget. A light moving along the ridge where no path exists, a silhouette climbing upward through the clouds, heading toward a summit no human will ever claim. In moments when the air stills and the earth seems to wait, Kailash stands unyielding, a frozen mystery bound to time itself. The hidden valley of Gyanganj, eastern Himalayas. They say there is a place the wind itself avoids naming, a story traded only between those who have seen too much silence. In the remote monasteries that cling to the cliffs of Sikkim and eastern Tibet, monks still whisper of a hidden sanctuary called Gyanganj, a valley sealed from ordinary sight. To speak of it too openly, they say, is to invite disorientation. The world bends, paths vanish, and one's sense of direction dissolves as though the mountain itself has turned away. No map dares to mark its boundaries, yet the legend endures, carried like a secret between breath and prayer. Each retelling changes the valley a little. Sometimes it lies beyond the snows of Kangchenjunga, other times deep within the mists of Bhutan. Some call it Siddhashram, others Shambhala, but all agree on one point. Gyanganj is not merely hidden by terrain, it is hidden by intention. The belief that certain Himalayan valleys were sealed off by divine will dates back more than 1,000 years, found in Buddhist Bayul prophecies that speak of refuges meant to appear only during times of great chaos. The eastern Himalayas, with their labyrinth of glacial ridges and perpetual fog, have long been considered the threshold where such a place could remain unseen even to modern instruments. Only later do the maps enter the story, tracing the high passes and river valleys between Sikkim and Tibet. Early British surveyors who ventured into the region in the 19th century often recorded strange absences, valleys that appeared in local accounts but never on their charts, routes that ended abruptly where the land seemed to fold into itself. Even the famed Russian explorer and mystic Nicholas Roerich, who led expeditions through these mountains in the 1920s, wrote of luminous horizons and hidden kingdoms glimpsed beyond the snow line. Roerich believed Gyanganj, which he called Shambhala, was not myth but reality, existing in a vibration beyond ordinary human awareness. His reports, written in measured scientific language, spoke of sudden magnetic anomalies and inexplicable stillness, as if the landscape itself were aware of being observed. Ancient sutras and tantric verses describe lands where the enlightened retreat from the decay of the world. The Kalachakra Tantra, one of the foundational texts of Tibetan Buddhism, refers to a hidden realm called Shambhala, a place of perfect balance and learning, sealed from human eyes until the world is ready. Later Hindu writings, including the Skanda Purana and esoteric commentaries of the Yoga Vasistha, mention Siddhashram, an invisible domain of perfected beings. Over centuries, the two names merged in Himalayan lore, and the valley came to symbolize a crossing point between the seen and the unseen. The persistence of the story across religious traditions lends it an unusual kind of authority, not easily dismissed, even by those who doubt its literal existence. In the last century, seekers came with notebooks, compasses, and hope. Among them were theosophists from India and Britain, mystics from Europe, and Tibetan lamas who claimed to know the way but refused to lead outsiders there. In 1939, a British intelligence officer stationed in Darjeeling wrote in his diary of monks who speak of a valley that cannot be approached by unclean thought. Nicholas Notovich, a Russian traveller earlier in the 1890s, mentioned rumours of a hidden monastery beyond the borders of Sikkim, though his accounts were dismissed as fabrication. Even Roerich's own son George, who was trained as an archaeologist, quietly admitted that his father's guides believed such a valley existed but warned that to find it was to lose the world. Some Tibetan monks speak of Gyanganj not as a place one can walk into, but as a vibration, a frequency of existence that reveals itself only to minds freed from attachment. This interpretation, drawn from tantric philosophy, suggests that the valley is interwoven with consciousness itself. One monk from the Pemyangtse monastery in Sikkim once told a visiting ethnographer, "If you go looking, you will never see it. If you stop looking, it may find you." Such statements frustrate science but have persisted for generations, spoken by men who have lived their entire lives within sight of peaks that no machine has fully mapped. Satellite images of these ranges reveal valleys, glaciers, and deep ravines, yet none match the descriptions passed through Himalayan legend. In 1997, an Indo-Tibetan survey team noted that certain radar scans near the Dongkaya range returned inconsistent readings, though nothing unusual was found on the ground. Modern explorers, armed with drones and infrared cameras, have attempted to pinpoint the supposed coordinates shared among older maps of Shambhala, only to find terrain that seems to shift under changing light. Trekkers in Sikkim occasionally report stretches of trail that feel wrong, distances that take too long to cross, echoes that sound delayed, and sudden weather changes that drive them back without reason. There are names carved into stones along forgotten trails, offerings to those who vanished seeking the invisible. Among these are monks whose monasteries still keep their records, describing pilgrimages that never returned. In 1962, an Indian yogi named Swami Purushottomananda claimed to have reached Gyanganj during a meditative retreat in the Himalayas, disappearing for months and reappearing emaciated but lucid. His disciples recorded his statement that the valley is not of earth but of light. No verifiable proof was ever found, yet his account reignited popular fascination, drawing both believers and skeptics back to the eastern Himalayas. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it resists verification yet refuses to die. Each generation inherits the same contradiction, a valley that exists in faith but vanishes under scrutiny. In the end, Gyanganj becomes less a place than a mirror, reflecting the desire to find something untouched by the noise of the world. Whether hidden by rock or illusion, its silence remains intact, its coordinates forever withheld. Somewhere between the clouds and the unseen, a valley still waits for a traveller who may never arrive. The Vanishings in Parvati Valley, India. Few places in the Indian Himalayas have acquired such a paradoxical reputation as Parvati Valley, a region of breathtaking serenity shadowed by an unsettling record of disappearances. Nestled within Himachal Pradesh, the valley stretches from the quiet village of Jari to the remote reaches of Pin Parvati Pass, a landscape of steep cedar forests, glacial rivers, and mist-laden ridges that seem to fold in on themselves. It is a place long favoured by trekkers, seekers and wanderers, drawn by its promise of isolation and beauty, yet bound to a name that has come to symbolise vanishing itself. Each year, hundreds enter Parvati Valley in search of its famed trails. The route to Kirganga's hot springs, the meandering ascent toward Tosh, or the perilous climb toward the high-altitude Pin Parvati Pass that connects Kulu to Spiti. Yet among those who have ventured deep into its folds, too many have failed to return. Since the 1990s, travellers, often young and experienced in mountain trekking, have disappeared without explanation, leaving behind tents, diaries and half-finished meals, but rarely a trace of themselves. Local authorities have long attributed these vanishings to treacherous terrain or sudden weather shifts, but those who know the valley best whisper that the pattern is too strange, too deliberate, to be dismissed as coincidence. The case of Justin Shetler in 2016 remains one of the most haunting. A former survivalist and travel blogger, he was last seen in the upper reaches near Kirganga, reportedly on a pilgrimage with a sadhu or wandering holy man. His journal entries from the days before he vanished were introspective, describing exhaustion and unease, yet a determination to reach a hidden cave said to hold spiritual power. His motorbike, parked in the village of Manikaran, was later recovered, but Justin was never found. Search teams scoured cliffsides and ravines, but the valley yielded nothing. No clothing, no body, no sign of a struggle. Even local guides, familiar with every ridge and path, described the disappearance as if the mountain had simply chosen to erase him. Nor was Shetler's case an anomaly. In 1996, Israeli backpacker Shlomi Carlbach vanished near the same stretch of forest, followed a few years later by Tommy Eiting from the Netherlands, whose tent was discovered intact beside the Parvati River, untouched by animals or weather. Locals recall the eerie detail that the river's flow, normally roaring and relentless, seemed unusually calm during the search, almost as if it were holding something back. Police investigations cited accident or drowning, yet no remains were ever recovered. Over the years, hikers have spoken of strange sounds at night, low droning voices carried by the wind or the echo of footsteps behind them on trails no one else was walking. Scientific explanations have been offered, but rarely satisfy those who have seen the valley's mood change without warning. The dense forests near Kalga and Pulga are known for sudden mists that roll in from the ridges, reducing visibility to nothing in seconds. Geologists point out that the area sits atop unstable rock layers, prone to silent landslides or sinkholes that can swallow entire sections of trail without leaving visible collapse. Yet the disappearances have continued even in open areas, in daylight, under clear skies. Villagers say that Parvati is not a valley to be measured only by topography. It is a place where time bends and distance deceives, where a familiar trail can lead to an unfamiliar end. In recent years, Parvati Valley's reputation has drawn spiritual pilgrims alongside backpackers. Many come seeking enlightenment through meditation, solitude, or entheogenic rituals tied to the region's potent hashish. Some believe the valley amplifies states of consciousness, acting as a conduit between worlds. Monks in nearby monasteries tell stories of Shambhala, the mythical hidden kingdom said to lie somewhere in the Himalayas, a realm of perfect wisdom that reveals itself only to the worthy. To them, those who vanish are not lost but taken beyond, crossing into a plane of existence the living cannot follow. The idea persists quietly, even among police and search teams who admit, when pressed, that the valley seems to decide who leaves and who doesn't. The weather too conspires with the myth. Monsoon rains turn trails into rivers of mud, and thin air above 3,000 meters disorients even the experienced. GPS signals fade among the ridges, compasses spin without pattern, and radios lose contact within minutes of entering the deeper forests. Satellite imagery has failed to detect some of the smaller crevices that plunge hundreds of meters down to the Parvati River. Yet despite the many expeditions that have mapped the valley, there remain zones of pure obscurity, places where the air feels heavy and sound travels strangely, as if muffled by something unseen. Local lore stretches back centuries, long before modern trekking began. The Parvati River, which gives the valley its name, is said to be sacred, born from the tears of the goddess Parvati herself. Folktales tell of travellers who mocked or defied the mountain spirit, only to be consumed by sudden storms or led astray by phantom lights dancing along the cliffs. Elders in Manikaran recount how even animals avoid certain parts of the forest, detouring miles around a single slope without prompting. The stories may seem ancient superstition, yet they echo eerily with the reports of modern vanishings, each one beginning in ordinary daylight, each one ending in silence. Today, Parvati Valley remains a paradox. It continues to attract those seeking beauty, peace, or transcendence, while holding within it a record of absences that defy explanation. Posters of the missing still hang on the notice boards of Kassel and Barshini, faded by years of rain and sun. Some show smiling faces, others passport photos, each one now part of the valley's quiet mythology. For every new traveller who arrives, another story lingers unfinished, another path ends where no one can follow. It's said the valley keeps its own count, and it is not finished yet. The Caves of Mustang, Nepal. From the air, the Mustang cliffs resemble the walls of a forgotten city, riddled with dark openings that seem less carved than eroded by time itself. Perched high along the Kali Gandaki River in northern Nepal, these ochre and red escarpments rise like the frozen waves of an ancient sea. Between them lies a silent desert of wind, a landscape so stark that it seems to exist outside of time. Yet hidden within those sheer faces are more than 10,000 man-made caves, chambers stacked one atop another, clustered like honeycomb, and suspended hundreds of meters above the valley floor. When explorers first stumbled upon these honeycombed cliffs, they mistook them for natural formations, mere scars of erosion. But as they climbed closer, they found markings impossible to explain away, chiseled footholds ascending vertical rock, blackened ceilings streaked with soot, and stairways carved from stone that led into darkness. The discovery was made in the 1990s, when archaeologists and mountaineers began documenting the caves that locals had long known of but rarely entered. What they uncovered was a network vast enough to house an entire civilization, yet strangely devoid of the signs that usually define one. Many of the chambers are positioned at heights that defy logic. Some are carved directly into cliff faces that rise over 150 feet, so high that reaching them today requires ropes and ladders. Yet these caves date back thousands of years, long before the tools or climbing techniques capable of such feats were known to exist in this region. The question that haunts researchers is not only how these people built their skybound dwellings, but why they chose to live suspended between earth and air. But the architecture speaks of something larger, an intentional design that transformed the landscape into both a fortress and a sanctuary. Excavations led by archaeologist Mark Aldenderfer and his team revealed layers of history embedded in the rock itself. Deep within certain caves, they discovered human remains placed in sitting positions, alongside bronze jewellery, bamboo bowls and small clay effigies. In others, murals cover the walls in pigments that have barely faded despite centuries of exposure to dust and wind, depictions of tantric deities, celestial beings, and mandalas that align perfectly with Tibetan Buddhist cosmology. Each layer of discovery seemed to contradict the last, turning the cliffs into a palimpsest of forgotten lives. Local legends offer their own explanations, speaking of a time when the valley was the cradle of a kingdom now erased from history. They call the region Lo, once part of a vast trade corridor linking Tibet and the Indian plains, a route that carried not only salt and silk but also beliefs and bloodlines. In the oral traditions of Mustang, the caves are said to have been dug by beings guided by divine instruction. Some say the disciples of Padmasambhava, others claim sky spirits taught men how to carve into stone without tools. Whether myth or memory, these stories align with the sense that the caves were never merely dwellings, but thresholds. Archaeologists, however, continue to find contradictions that deepen rather than resolve the mystery. In some caves, they uncovered skeletons showing signs of violent death, skulls fractured by blunt instruments, bones arranged as if hurriedly buried. In others, they found entire families interred together, surrounded by grain, textiles and amulets, suggesting a ritual significance beyond survival. One chamber contained manuscripts written in an ancient form of Tibetan script that no one has fully deciphered. Every discovery brings the same realization. The caves are not the remnants of a single people or era, but the echo of something continuous, an idea that refused to die. The landscape itself seems to conspire in keeping its secrets. The Kali Gandaki Gorge, one of the deepest in the world, runs through Mustang like a scar, and strong winds roar through it daily, carrying dust that obscures the cliffs within minutes. The altitude and isolation have preserved the caves, but also protect their silence. Storms can erase footprints within hours, and travellers describe the sensation of being watched by the very walls they climb. Despite years of excavation, entire sections of the cliffside remain inaccessible, either too unstable or too perilous to reach. Even drone surveys have failed to map the full extent of the network, suggesting the mountain still hides more than it reveals. Inside the caves, the air feels untouched, dry as parchment, smelling faintly of dust and the memory of fire. Narrow corridors lead into chambers where the light fades into a sepia half-darkness, revealing carvings of eyes and swirling patterns etched into the stone. It is said that monks once used these caves to meditate in isolation for years, their voices never carried beyond the rock. Others were storage vaults for texts that vanished during centuries of conflict, protected by altitude and obscurity. There are reports of hermits still living in some of the higher caves, though few outsiders have seen them, and those who claim to have encountered them describe faces that seemed unnaturally pale, as if sculpted from the stone itself. The mystery of Mustang is not simply archaeological, it is existential. The more that scientists uncover, the less cohesive the narrative becomes. These cliffs contain fragments of human intention, faith, and fear, arranged without clear sequence, defying the neat timelines of history. Some experts suggest that the caves mark the movement of populations fleeing shifting climates or invasions. Others believe they represent spiritual withdrawal, a deliberate retreat from the world below. Yet none can explain how, across thousands of years, generation after generation returned to the same walls to dig, paint, and bury their dead, as though bound by a memory older than civilization itself. What remains sealed in those walls may not belong to history at all, but to something that was never meant to be found. The Lost Expedition of Nanga Parbat, Pakistan. From the first recorded attempt to scale its icy ramparts, Nanga Parbat has been less a mountain than a sentence waiting to be carried out. Rising 8,126 metres above the valleys of Gilgit-Baltistan, it stands alone as the western sentinel of the Himalayas, vast and remote, where wind and altitude conspire against every living thing. German mountaineers in the early 20th century gave it a name that endures to this day, Der Schicksalsberg, the Mountain of Destiny, and it soon became known by another, more chilling title, the Killer Mountain. Before the 1990s, its fatality rate was among the highest in the world, claiming nearly 1 in 4 who dared to ascend. Those who studied the mountain's history noted a pattern as precise as a heartbeat, a cycle of human ambition, sudden weather, and silence that followed. In the summer of 1934, the German climber Willy Merkel led an expedition that would define the mountain's infamy. Backed by the Nazi regime and financed as a symbol of national endurance, it aimed to conquer Nanga Parbat's Rakiot face, a glacial wall so vast it appeared almost vertical from the valley below. The expedition began with optimism, but the weather turned without warning. For days, hurricane-force winds tore through the camps, collapsing tents and burying ropes beneath meters of snow. Merkel's final notes, recovered years later, described a cold that burned through thought. When rescuers finally reached the site, they found the bodies of 10 climbers and Sherpa guides frozen mid-descent, their outlines preserved like fossils within ice. Even today, climbers report glimpsing old equipment half buried in snowfields, relics from a time when maps were still drawn by hand and courage often outweighed knowledge. Even after that catastrophe, the call of Nanga Parbat only grew stronger, its white face a lure no rational mind could ignore. Between 1937 and 1953, successive German and Austrian expeditions followed, driven by the belief that destiny could be rewritten through persistence. In 1937, a camp of 16 men was swept away by an avalanche that thundered down from the Rakiot face in the dead of night. None survived. The debris field, visible for years afterward, stretched across the glacier like a scar. Yet the very next decade brought new climbers and new graves. Not until 1953 did success come, when Austrian alpinist Hermann Buell reached the summit alone after a 41-hour push without oxygen. He later admitted to hallucinating a phantom companion during the climb, a figure walking beside him in the snow who vanished each time he turned to look. For many, it was the first recorded suggestion that Nanga Parbat was not only perilous but somehow haunted. When Reinhold Messner and his brother Gunther began their ascent in 1970, it was meant to mark a new era of modern alpinism. Lightweight, fast, and daring. But the climb unfolded into tragedy. After reaching the summit, the brothers descended opposite sides of the mountain in confusion and exhaustion. Reinhold survived, emerging days later from the Deermere face. Frostbitten, starving, and alone. Gunther was never seen again. Reinhold's account of the storm that struck during their descent divided the mountaineering world. Some accused him of abandoning his brother, while others saw it as a testament to survival beyond reason. It wasn't until 2005, 35 years later, that fragments of Gunther's remains were discovered on the Deermere face, confirming some of Reinhold's testimony, yet deepening the riddle of how his brother's body ended up there. To many, it seemed the mountain had withheld the truth until it chose to speak. Through the following decades, Nanga Parbat continued to draw climbers who sought redemption, fame, or a kind of communion with danger. The Polish mountaineer Jerzy Kukuczka once described its slopes as a place that remembers you. In 1989, a Korean expedition vanished after a sudden storm erased all traces of their route. Search teams found only one tent, intact but empty, its fabric fluttering in perfect stillness despite the high winds above. Locals in the nearby village of Tarashing tell of luminous shapes seen moving across the glacier at night, sometimes described as lanterns, sometimes as souls. Whether these tales began as superstition or memory, no one can say for certain. Modern climbers speak of sudden winds that shift direction without warning, of avalanches that fall in complete silence, and of eerie calm that precedes disaster. Meteorologists have documented rapid pressure drops unique to this massif, as if weather itself behaves differently in its shadow. In 2013, tragedy struck again, not from nature but from human hands. Armed militants stormed the Nanga Parbat base camp and executed 10 foreign climbers and their Pakistani guide. The attack shocked the mountaineering world, but among local communities it was described with an unsettling refrain, that the mountain had been violated once more. Expeditions that followed reported strange electrical storms above the Deermere face, flashes of light with no sound, and winds that seemed to reverse mid-blow. To the villagers below, such events were not coincidences, but reminders of a mountain that watched and remembered. To those who have stood at its base and felt the air still before the storm, Nanga Parbat is not a mountain but a threshold between the known and the unforgiving. Every rope anchored to its ice, every name etched into memorial stones near base camp, marks the fragile divide between defiance and surrender. Over 90 documented deaths have occurred along its faces, many within sight of rescue. Some climbers who returned spoke of inexplicable sensations, of whispers in the wind, of being followed, of unseen motion just beyond their headlamps. Yet for every story of terror, there is another of transcendence, of climbers who felt closer to something immense and indifferent. In that contradiction lies the true mystery of Nanga Parbat, that death and revelation have always shared the same path. In that boundless stillness where the air itself seems to listen, the mountain keeps its own counsel, patient, unbroken, and unwilling to forget. The Snow Woman of Bhutan, Yeti variant. In the high valleys of Bhutan, there is a story told in winter, of a woman made of snow whose shadow moves where no tracks should form. Her presence is felt when fog gathers along the ridgelines, when herds of yaks grow restless, and the wind carries a voice that sounds almost human. The elders call her Domo, others name her Migoi, and though the word translates roughly to wild man, her form is described as unmistakably female, tall, pale and solemn, as though shaped from the very mountains that conceal her. To the Bhutanese, the Snow Woman is neither myth nor beast but a guardian, an ancient inhabitant of the hidden world known as Bayul, the sacred valleys believed to be sanctuaries of spiritual refuge. In Buddhist cosmology, the Himalayas are not merely mountains but living entities, protectors of enlightenment and reminders of impermanence. Within this understanding, the Domo is not an intruder but a watcher of thresholds, one who keeps the sanctity of the hidden valleys intact. Monks in the Sakteng region still speak of her as a custodian spirit who reveals herself only when balance is disturbed, when humans stray too far into lands not meant for habitation. In 1966, the Bhutanese government established the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary in the eastern district of Trashigang, officially to protect red pandas and snow leopards, but unofficially, as officials quietly admitted, to safeguard the realm of the Migoi. Covering over 700 square kilometres, the sanctuary remains one of the most remote and least explored regions of Bhutan, its dense rhododendron forests and mist-wrapped cliffs forming a landscape that feels half-imagined. When asked about the unusual decision to recognise a mythic creature in lore, one forestry officer simply remarked that, "There are things in these forests that are better left undisturbed." Villagers of the Brokpa community recount nights when a towering figure crossed the ridges, draped in white fur, leaving steaming footprints that melted before dawn. In these accounts, the Snow Woman does not harm but observes, appearing when a traveller loses his way or when herds drift towards sacred slopes. Her face, when described, is said to hold neither malice nor warmth, only the stillness of stone. Such stories are preserved not as tales for children but as warnings, reminders that the mountains keep their own hierarchy and that certain places remain forbidden. When foreign expeditions began venturing into Bhutan during the mid-20th century, they found that every conversation about the creature was spoken in whispers. In this land, the spirit that roamed the snows was not a brute but something older and far more elusive. In 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary, fresh from his Everest triumph, led an expedition across the Himalayas to investigate the Yeti legend, collecting supposed relics, tufts of hair, a scalp preserved in a monastery, yet none offered clarity. In Bhutan, monks who heard of these efforts regarded them with quiet amusement, insisting that no net or camera could trap a creature that existed in both the physical and spiritual worlds. Modern science has since turned its gaze upon these legends. In 2014, a genetic analysis by Oxford University and the University of Lausanne examined several Yeti samples, revealing close ties to ancient polar bears and Himalayan brown bears. To many, it seemed the final answer to a century of speculation. Yet in Bhutan, the findings did not diminish belief. Locals pointed out that the Migoi was never just an animal, that the science addressed bones and hair, not the unseen presence that moved in storms and silences. Even biologists who have worked in Sakteng admit that the remoteness of the terrain, the altitude, and the unpredictable weather make the area one of the least studied ecosystems in Asia, a place where the line between myth and biology still blurs. The forests of eastern Bhutan, heavy with mist and juniper, form a labyrinth of steep ravines and glacial streams where visibility collapses into white. Here, sound travels oddly, echoing between ridges so that a single footstep may seem to come from all directions at once. It is not difficult to imagine how isolation sharpens imagination, yet it is just as easy to believe that something ancient watches from behind those curtains of fog. Rangers have reported finding sets of footprints in fresh snow, the stride too long for a human, the depth too heavy for a bear. The tracks lead into the upper ridges toward the Beyoul and then vanish completely, as though absorbed by the mountain. Monks in remote monasteries describe the Snow Woman as a restless emanation, a being who appears when harmony is broken between the human and the natural. Some say her presence has become more frequent as the glaciers retreat and sacred lands are opened for development. In these teachings, she's not a monster to be feared, but a manifestation of imbalance, a reminder of what the mountains lose when their silence is disturbed. Offerings of butter lamps are still made in some villages when strange cries echo across the valleys, a gesture not of fear, but of respect. In Bhutan's distant borderlands, they do not doubt her. They speak of her as if she never left. Rangers patrol trails lined with prayer flags that flutter against the wind, carrying the hope that the old balance remains intact. At night, when mist gathers low and the air turns brittle, some claim to hear the slow rhythm of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, unhurried, receding into the unseen. And though no photograph has ever captured her, no evidence has survived scrutiny, the stories persist with the same quiet endurance as the mountains themselves. Past the timberline, where silence turns to wind, she moves unseen, a secret the mountains have chosen to keep. The mysterious roar of Kangchenjunga, Nepal-India border. Long before its source was named, the sound was known, a deep shuddering resonance that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. It was said to roll across the high valleys without wind, without storm, a thunder that moved as though alive beneath the snow. Shepherds heard it in the stillness of dawn, their flocks suddenly restless though the sky remained untouched by cloud. Traders crossing the old caravan routes swore it could be felt more than heard, a vibration that passed through stone and skin alike. Across generations, the phenomenon remained nameless yet familiar, a secret rhythm of the mountains no one could trace to its beginning. Only later did the stories converge upon one mountain, Kangchenjunga, the five-peak titan on the Nepal-India border. Towering at 8,586 metres, it was more than a landmark, it was a presence. Among the Himalayan summits, only Everest and K2 stood higher, yet none carried such reverence. For centuries, the people of Sikkim and eastern Nepal have considered its slopes sacred, so much so that climbers once stopped short of its highest point, unwilling to set foot upon the summit itself. And it was here, within this vast and forbidden massif, that the mysterious roar seemed to find its home, reverberating through glaciers and valleys that never echoed human noise in return. Early British surveyors in the 19th century wrote of unaccountable noises echoing through the valleys, mistaking them first for avalanches. In journals preserved in Darjeeling's archives, their notes describe the ground trembling beneath them on clear days, followed by a booming sound that faded into the distance without triggering falling snow. Some explorers blamed expanding ice or unseen rock slides, while others admitted that the reports defied physical explanation. They learned quickly that local porters refused to discuss the noise in detail, insisting it should not be spoken of aloud, especially near the mountain's shadow. To the Lepcha and the Bhutia, the roar was never a mystery of nature but a voice, a sign that the mountain's guardians were awake. According to their traditions, Kangchenjunga is not merely a mountain but a living deity, the protector of hidden valleys and unseen spirits that dwell within its folds. Each of its 5 summits represents one of the 5 treasures of the Great Snow: gold, grain, gems, salt, and sacred scriptures, divine gifts meant for a future age. In this cosmology, the thunder that rolls through its slopes is not random sound but communication, a reminder that the divine still watches over a world increasingly deaf to its presence. Monasteries in Sikkim even maintain rituals of silence when the sound is reported, believing it marks moments when the mortal and spiritual worlds momentarily overlap. When geologists later tried to chart the source, they found the sound refused to be contained by their instruments. In the late 20th century, teams from the Indian Geological Survey and Kathmandu University carried infrasound detectors, seismographs and temperature gauges to measure any correlation between the roar and seismic activity. Although micro-tremors were occasionally recorded, none aligned precisely with the moments when locals reported the booming noise. Some researchers suggested resonance between glacier caverns and trapped air currents. Others proposed shifting permafrost layers or sudden glacial cracking amplified by the deep valley walls. Yet for every proposed cause, the evidence remained elusive. The roar appeared when least expected, then vanished before it could be measured. Veteran climbers speak of nights when the ground itself seemed to hum, as though a great engine moved beneath the ice. In 1997, a Sherpa guide leading an expedition toward the Zimu Glacier claimed the sound passed directly under their camp, a vibration so powerful that snow drifted from the tent walls, though the air was completely still. Others have recalled standing high on the mountain's ridges and hearing the sound rise from below rather than above, spreading upward like breath exhaled by the mountain itself. Some, shaken by the experience, never returned, saying it felt less like noise than presence, as if the mountain were acknowledging them. In the valleys of Zemu and Lonak, shepherds have long reported the same tremor, a rolling sound that vanishes as soon as it is sought. Entire communities pause when it comes, falling silent until it fades, uncertain whether it signals blessing or warning. Local elders recall seasons when the roar coincided with distant avalanches or sudden shifts in weather, yet just as often it came during periods of calm, defying any natural rhythm. To them, the sound belongs to the mountain alone, surfacing when balance is disturbed or when travellers pass too far into its inner sanctum. Recent research expeditions, armed with infrasound detectors and seismic sensors, hoped to solve what folklore had guarded for centuries. Studies in the early 2000s suggested the Himalayas generate low-frequency sound waves through friction between moving ice masses, but none of those patterns matched the distinctive localized roar of Kangchenjunga. Some scientists have speculated that subterranean caverns or deep geothermal vents could create acoustic resonance when pressure changes occur, yet there is no volcanic activity recorded in the region. Even drone-mounted microphones deployed in recent years have returned inconclusive data, only a faint pulse of sound, irregular and fading, as though the mountain chooses when to be heard. Echoing through time, the roar beneath the mountain carries both warning and benediction, an ancient rhythm generations have never forgotten. When it rises, monks at the hilltop monasteries light butter lamps and leave offerings by their doors, while trekkers on the trails below stop and wait, uncertain whether the sound is natural or something more. The roar has become part of life here, as familiar as wind or prayer, yet untouched by certainty. In a range where every echo carries a legend, this one remains the loudest and least understood of them all. Still, the sound moves through the high air, unclaimed by science or silence alike. The phantom lights of Ladakh, India. On the coldest nights above Ladakh's high plateaus, the silence itself seems to have weight. It is here, in the desolate expanse of the eastern Himalayas, that faint lights have been seen drifting over the barren ground. Not meteors or aircraft, but slow-moving orbs that rise, hover and vanish without sound. They appear where no settlements stand, over ranges where even radio signals falter, and they have persisted long enough to become one of the most enduring mysteries of the high Himalayas. Reports began quietly, passed between men stationed in the thin air of the border outposts. Indian army patrols along the line of actual control spoke of glowing spheres that emerged from the horizon and travelled steadily through the night sky, unaffected by wind or terrain. Some lights rose from the ground itself, climbing vertically before drifting toward the mountains. Others followed paths parallel to the earth, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. Soldiers accustomed to the dangers of isolation described the lights not as hostile, but as watchful, moving with a kind of deliberate grace that no flare or drone could imitate. The earliest consistent accounts came from the late 1990s, when members of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police stationed near Pangong TSO began recording repeated appearances of these lights. Patrol logs noted that they were visible through night vision devices but produced no radar signature. The objects glowed with an amber or whitish hue and travelled with unbroken motion, occasionally splitting into multiple points of light before fading completely. In the region known as Konka La, the Earth itself behaves strangely. The area sits directly along a major tectonic boundary between the Indian and Eurasian plates, a landscape fractured by hidden geothermal vents and magnetic irregularities. Compasses spin erratically, and certain frequencies of radio transmission fail without warning. Locals who traverse the region on pilgrimage routes speak of invisible presences that disturb livestock and unsettle travellers. Even before the lights were documented, the region had been considered spiritually charged, a place where the physical and the unseen briefly overlap. By the early 2000s, the strange activity had drawn the attention of both curiosity and caution. Units of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police near the Pangong Basin began keeping systematic logs of the sightings, noting precise coordinates and atmospheric conditions. In 2012, after nearly a decade of recurring incidents, Indian Army officials requested an inquiry involving the Defence Research and Development Organisation, DRDO, and the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. Teams were dispatched to Ladakh to investigate, equipped with ground radar, electromagnetic sensors, and optical telescopes. Yet despite extensive monitoring, no aircraft, drone, or known celestial object matched the movements of the glowing spheres. Scientists who later examined the data offered theories that struggled to match what was seen. Some proposed that tectonic stress in the region might produce glowing plasma or earthquake lights, rare phenomena where underground pressure releases bursts of ionized gas. Others suggested misidentified satellites, distant meteorological balloons, or reflections from secret military experiments across the border. Yet none of these explanations aligned with the observed motion of the lights, which seemed to move both horizontally and vertically, often against prevailing wind patterns. The orbs, witnesses claimed, exhibited intention, changing direction, pausing, and resuming movement as if under conscious control. The Hanle Observatory, one of the world's highest astronomical facilities, lies not far from the main area of sightings. Astronomers stationed there reported no trace of unusual cosmic activity during the nights when the lights were recorded, eliminating meteor showers or re-entering debris. However, they noted the presence of minor geomagnetic fluctuations, subtle shifts that could, in theory, interact with ionized particles near the Earth's surface. Yet even these remained hypothetical. The lights behaved too coherently, too precisely, to be dismissed as random plasma bursts. Among the villagers of Neoma and Chushul, the lights are older than memory. Long before soldiers patrolled the region, herders told of luminous beings who guarded the sacred mountains from intrusion. In certain valleys, it was believed the spirits of those who died in snowstorms would wander as glowing forms, forever retracing the paths of their final journey. Buddhist lamas in nearby monasteries described the phenomenon in ancient texts as longta, wind spirits that manifest as radiant energy when the world's balance is disturbed. In this view, the lights are not intrusions from beyond, but signs that the earth itself is alive and restless. Expeditions reached their edges and stopped, as if the land itself had drawn a line no human was meant to cross. The Konkan Pass remains heavily restricted due to its position on the disputed border between India and China, and both nations discourage access to the surrounding terrain. Nonetheless, accounts have emerged from satellite analysts, trekkers, and Tibetan refugees who claim to have witnessed similar lights farther north near the Nubra Valley and the Aksai Chin region. Some of these reports describe the orbs descending close to the ground before vanishing without a trace, leaving no heat or electromagnetic disturbance detectable afterward. On rare cloudless nights, they rise wordlessly above the horizon like questions the Earth has refused to answer. The lights drift through air so thin it barely carries sound, crossing over glaciers that hide the remains of forgotten expeditions and lost routes. For some, they represent a natural wonder waiting to be decoded. For others, they are remnants of an older presence, still watching the restless world from the unbroken silence of the mountains. To those who have seen them, no explanation feels sufficient. Only the unsettling certainty that something aware moves across those high plateaus, untethered from anything we understand. Sometimes, on the nights when the winds fall still, the lights linger longer than before, as though listening to the quiet that once concealed them. The immovable stones of Markha Valley, India. Among the scattered ruins of Ladakh's forgotten trails, there are stones that no one remembers placing, and none have ever managed to move. They rest in quiet formation along ridges and slopes where gravity and erosion should have long undone their order. yet they remain anchored as if by some unseen resolve. Shepherds once tried to clear them to make way for grazing paths, but the ground beneath resisted all effort, swallowing shovels and splitting iron tools. Even now, those who stumble upon them find no explanation, only the feeling that the land itself has chosen to keep them where they stand. They stand within the Markha Valley, a high-altitude corridor carved between the ridges of the Zanskar Range, where wind and water erase almost everything except what chooses to remain. At nearly 3,700 meters above sea level, the valley stretches through arid desert slopes and frozen streams, its ochre cliffs shaped by glacial torrents that have long receded toward the north. For centuries, this narrow corridor served as both a trade route and a spiritual passage, a bridge between monastic strongholds and high passes like Kongmaru La, where travellers offered small stones as tributes to the spirits of the wind. Amid this severe beauty, the immovable stones stand apart, unmapped and unnamed, yet always found again by those who return. The first written accounts came from Buddhist monks travelling between Hemis and the ancient monastery of Hankar, who mark the stones on route maps as guardians of the pass. Their notes, preserved in fragmented manuscripts stored in Leh's Central Asian Museum, speak of silent watchers that neither shifted in flood nor crumbled in frost. These early travellers described the stones as points of orientation, landmarks to measure distance in a valley otherwise mutable with weather and sand. Later, 19th century surveyors of the British Indian Border Commissions also recorded similar formations, but dismissed them as glacial remnants, though their reports mentioned the peculiar symmetry of their placement. Each boulder rises like a pillar half buried in the soil, smooth on one side and rough on the other, aligned as though positioned by intent rather than erosion. Some reach the height of a man, others barely emerge from the earth, yet all share a uniform orientation. Their polished faces turned east toward the morning sun. Petrographic analysis of smaller fragments indicates a high content of granite and gneiss, materials typical of the surrounding Zanskar formations, but their density exceeds that of nearby strata, suggesting deep metamorphic origins. To this day, they remain fixed, not by human reverence alone, but by something the terrain itself seems unwilling to yield. The villagers of Markha say the stones were once living beings. Monks turned to rock for breaking a vow of silence. During certain rituals, small offerings of barley and butter lamps are placed before them, and children are taught to walk around them clockwise before long journeys. Older residents recount that storms never cross the valley when prayers are whispered near the stones, as though the mountains themselves listen. These beliefs trace back to a syncretic blend of Bon and Buddhist cosmology, where natural formations are seen as manifestations of unseen consciousness, not symbols, but presences. In recent decades, geologists and trekkers from Leh have taken renewed interest in the stones, hoping to trace their origins through fault mapping and glacial records. Surveys conducted by the Geological Survey of India in 1996 documented unusual ground resistivity readings beneath several clusters, hinting at dense mineral layering or trapped ice pockets below. The more scientists investigated, the more contradictions appeared. The stones seem to defy both erosion rates and soil movement models for a region subject to such extreme freeze-thaw cycles. Even experienced mountaineers describe the formations as unnervingly deliberate, as though shaped by both geology and intention. Some suggest the stones may have been remnants of an ancient moraine, compacted under millennia of ice, their bases fused deep into permafrost layers that never fully thaw. Yet this explanation struggles to account for their spacing and alignment, which seem more architectural than random. Remote sensing imagery reveals near-parallel orientations across multiple sites, each separated by consistent distances, hinting at a pattern rather than coincidence. If they were indeed left by glacial retreat, they would have weathered unevenly, scattered across slopes, but they do not. Others hypothesize tectonic uplift or localized magnetic anomalies, though instruments have found no significant deviations in the valley's field strength. The stones, it seems, obey no single theory, standing instead as quiet contradictions to both faith and science. Trekkers who pass through the valley describe a silence that thickens near the stones, a stillness so absolute that footsteps seem to fade before reaching the air. Along the trail from Nimaling toward the Kongmaru La Pass, the wind howls through every hollow except this one stretch, where even prayer flags seem to hang heavier, their frayed edges motionless despite the gale. Some claim compasses spin erratically near certain clusters, though no consistent readings confirm it. Others simply pause, sensing that the stones are not objects but witnesses, patient, unmoved, and endlessly aware. In a landscape where glaciers advance and vanish within a lifetime, these stones seem to obey another measure of time entirely. Their immobility contrasts with the valley's shifting sands and vanishing streams, reminding those who pass that permanence may not be a matter of force, but of purpose. The people of Markha Valley continue to live beneath their watch, building homes from softer stone and carving paths that bend around their bases. For centuries they have endured drought, landslides and isolation. Yet the stones endure longer still, unshaken and unspeaking, part of a silence that neither welcomes nor denies comprehension. Perhaps in that silence lies the answer, though it may be one no one dares to unearth. When night falls across Markha Valley, the stones remain exactly where they have always been, waiting, perhaps, for the world to shift instead. The unfrozen patch of Gurudongmar Lake, Sikkim, India. Among the high ridges of Sikkim, where the wind slices through the thin air and snow stretches to the horizon, Gurudongmar Lake lies at an elevation of 5,430 metres, its icy waters reflecting the jagged peaks around it. For most of the winter, the lake is a solid sheet of ice, a silent mirror frozen under the weight of sub-zero temperatures that regularly dip below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Yet, at one corner of this sacred body of water, a patch refuses to freeze, defying the relentless cold and the laws of nature that govern the rest of the Himalayan plateau. Scientists visiting the region have measured water temperatures in this area that are paradoxically higher than the surrounding lake, but no geothermal vents, hot springs, or visible heat sources appear to explain the anomaly. Locals revere this unfrozen section, claiming it embodies unseen forces, though explanations remain symbolic rather than empirical. The lake itself, stretching over 4.5 square kilometres, is fed by snowmelt and glacial runoff. Its waters exceptionally clear due to minimal organic material and low human interference. The clarity allows unusual visibility into the lakebed even at shallow depths, and it is here, beneath the unmoving ice, that some researchers have observed currents that do not correspond to the usual inflows and outflows. During expeditions in the early 2000s, hydrologists recorded subtle eddies in this particular sector of the lake, a circulation that persisted even on calm days without wind. Attempts to trace these movements to underwater springs have produced conflicting data, leaving scientists unsure if the phenomenon is mechanical, chemical, or something else entirely. Remote sensing imagery shows the patch as a dark anomaly, a consistent yet inexplicable feature of Gurudongmar's frozen expanse. While empirical evidence accumulates, local folklore persists alongside it, stubbornly resisting straightforward explanation. The Lepcha people call the lake Dodasa Tsho, or Lake of the Hidden God, and recount stories of a spirit guardian whose presence keeps the waters alive in one place, even when all else succumbs to frost. Pilgrims who trek the treacherous routes to the lake during the festival of Sagadawa, when Buddhist communities honour the enlightenment of Buddha, claim that prayers offered near the unfrozen patch are absorbed differently, a sensation they describe as the air itself trembling with awareness. Anthropologists note that descriptions focus on physical sensations and minor optical illusions, hinting at an unverified interaction between human perception and the local microclimate. Scientific teams attempting to model the thermal properties of Gurudongmar Lake face additional complications from the region's extreme conditions. The high-altitude environment reduces air pressure, affecting heat transfer between water and atmosphere, and ultraviolet radiation at such elevation is intense enough to influence ice formation in ways rarely observed at lower latitudes. Even so, standard models of freezing lakes predict that every square metre of water at the lake's altitude and temperature should be solidly icebound by midwinter. Yet the same patch remains liquid, resistant not only to the expected freezing process, but also to seasonal variation, maintaining an almost constant size and location year after year. Some geologists hypothesize a small, unknown spring beneath the lakebed, but no conclusive evidence has emerged. magnetic anomalies recorded nearby further complicate the picture, hinting at a subtle interplay of geological factors that could, in theory, influence water density or heat retention in ways not yet understood. After countless trials in controlled conditions, the water from the patch still refused to freeze as expected. The water behaves like any other high-altitude freshwater under cold conditions, solidifying normally when isolated from the lake, suggesting that the effect depends on its precise location and surrounding environment. Researchers speculated about microbial life or chemical composition, but tests reveal only traces comparable to the rest of the lake. This absence of a definitive cause reinforces the sense of wonder and frustration surrounding the lake. Each expedition, from remote sensing specialists to geochemists, returns with meticulous measurements and photographs, but all are confronted by the same inexplicable truth. A small area of Gurudongmar Lake remains permanently unfrozen in a landscape where nothing else defies the cold. The significance of the unfrozen patch extends beyond scientific curiosity. It carries implications for local ecology and human activity. Migratory birds have been observed using the liquid section as a resting point during early spring, when most water bodies remain sealed by ice, suggesting that the anomaly might subtly influence wildlife patterns in the otherwise harsh terrain. Similarly, trekking routes that pass near the lake require careful navigation, as the boundary between frozen and liquid water is deceptively sharp, posing dangers for those unaware of the patch's location. Historically, ritual purification preserved the lake largely unaffected by human interference. This accidental protection has allowed the phenomenon to persist, offering a rare opportunity for study in near-pristine conditions, but also leaving the mystery largely intact for anyone seeking a definitive explanation. Despite decades of observation and measurement, the unfrozen patch at Gurudongmar Lake remains a silent enigma at the edge of human understanding. Seasonal ice forms around it, snow accumulates, and winds howl across the surrounding mountains, yet this small portion of liquid water persists, as if sheltered by invisible hands. For all the technological advances in satellite imaging, thermal analysis, and hydrodynamic modelling, no explanation satisfies both empirical rigour and observational consistency. Travellers, pilgrims, and scientists alike are drawn to it, not only for its spiritual significance or the allure of untouched nature, but because it represents a direct challenge to what is assumed to be possible at the extreme edges of the Earth. The lake, vast and formidable, continues its slow, deliberate silence, holding within its icy borders a secret that refuses to surface. Even as the winter sun rises over the snow-laden peaks, that single patch of water waits, defying everything we think we know about ice and cold. The Yeti footprints of the high Himalayas, Nepal, Tibet. Fresh snow stretched in all directions when a mountaineer froze, staring at a series of enormous footprints pressed into the white surface, their shape both human and impossible, each impression sinking deep into the fragile crust as though whatever had left them carried a weight far beyond a normal human's. The tracks measured nearly 40 centimetres in length, with toes splayed and a pronounced arch, and they continued over a rise and disappeared into a ridge shrouded in mist, leaving observers with a sense of both awe and unease. Expedition members noted that the stride suggested a bipedal gait, but the depth of the prints indicated a force that far exceeded the body mass of any known local fauna. Cameras clicked, notebooks were filled, and yet every attempt to trace the origin of the prints only led to more questions, because the marks seemed to vanish where paths converged with natural avalanche slopes or snowdrifts that could erase them in hours. For those standing in the silent high-altitude wilderness, the prints were more than a curiosity. They were a direct challenge to conventional understanding of Himalayan wildlife and human reach. Accounts of similar tracks stretch back over a century, recorded by explorers and mountaineers who dared venture into regions few humans have trodden, their journals detailing encounters that range from fleeting glimpses of enormous shadows to full-length impressions left behind in fresh snow. In 1925, during an expedition to Mount Everest, Eric Shipton photographed what became known as the Men of the Snows, a series of large, clearly defined footprints at Attara, an altitude above 6,000 metres, with dimensions that baffled zoologists who later studied the images. Soviet expeditions to the Tian Shan and Hindu Kush mountains reported analogous discoveries in the 1950s, with witnesses describing tracks that defied any bear or known predator pattern and appeared in locations inaccessible to humans without specialized equipment. These historical records, often dismissed by mainstream science, form a chain of sightings that collectively suggest an enduring phenomenon rather than isolated misperception, implying that the mystery has persisted for generations in the high Himalayas. Detailed casts made from fresh snow provide some of the most compelling physical evidence, revealing footprints that often measure 38 to 42 centimeters in length, with a breadth proportionally wider than a typical human foot. The impressions frequently display a central arch that curves unnaturally, and toes that, in some examples, appear slightly clawed or tapered, with spacing that suggests a stride exceeding 2 meters. When scientists and mountaineers attempt to replicate these prints using known animals or human mannequins under similar conditions, the results fail to match the depth, proportion, and clarity seen in the original impressions. Snow density, temperature, and underlying ice all affect how footprints form, yet even after repeated measurements across multiple locations, the anomalous tracks maintain a consistency that resists natural explanation. Instruments occasionally detect subtle variations in snow compaction surrounding the prints, as if the ground itself momentarily yielded to an unseen force, only to return to its former solidity once the tracks vanish from view. For centuries, Sherpa and Tibetan communities have woven the presence of a solitary human-like creature into both practical survival narratives and spiritual lore, describing beings that dwell in glaciated passes and dense rocky valleys far from villages or cultivated lands. Known variously as the Meitei, Migoi, or Yeti, these creatures are said to leave behind footprints that appear after storms, vanish under moonlight, and sometimes reappear at higher altitudes, as though moving with a purpose hidden from human observation. Oral histories recount how shepherds and pilgrims would sometimes follow tracks that led to cliffs, glacier edges, or ice caves, only for the prints to disappear, leaving behind no evidence of passage. Anthropologists and ethnographers note that these stories often correlate with known high-altitude wildlife behaviour, yet the sheer size and consistency of the prints and documented encounters suggest that something else, entirely unclassified, may be involved. Modern expeditions have approached the mystery with scientific rigour, employing GPS tracking, aerial drones, and even DNA sampling in hopes of identifying the creature behind the footprints. Snow and hair samples recovered near suspected tracks occasionally yield inconclusive results, with some samples matching known species such as bears or canids, while others produce ambiguous genetic sequences that resist classification. Thermal cameras and satellite imagery occasionally capture fleeting heat signatures or shadowed movement patterns in remote valleys, yet nothing conclusive has ever emerged. Even well-funded studies led by zoologists and glaciologists admit that the phenomenon persists as an unsolved enigma, with physical evidence pointing to something tangible yet eluding definitive identification. Every new expedition renews the intrigue, combining the allure of a scientific puzzle with the suspense of an unexplained wilderness. Environmental and psychological factors also play a role in shaping the observations, as high-altitude conditions can distort perception and memory. Thin air reduces oxygen levels, leading to hypoxia that affects coordination and visual processing, while shifting snow and optical illusions create the impression of larger or deeper prints. Wind, avalanche deposits, and snowmelt further complicate investigations, yet some footprints exhibit traits that cannot be explained by these conditions alone. The tracks frequently appear in patterns that suggest purposeful navigation across glaciers and ridges, often in areas inaccessible to humans without mountaineering equipment, and show signs of repeated use over time, reinforcing the idea that a consistent presence moves across these remote regions. Though decades of research have scoured the snowfields of the Himalayas, footprints continue to vanish as swiftly as they appear, as if the mountains are guarding a secret no human can reach. The evidence persists in photographs, casts, and eyewitness accounts, haunting every high-altitude expedition with the knowledge that something enormous, elusive, and undeniably real may roam where humans rarely tread. Amid the biting cold and rarefied air of the high Himalayas, a lone footprint waits silently for discovery. The vanishing Monastery of Tsangon, Tibet. Ancient Tibetan texts from the 15th century speak of a monastery perched on a remote ridge, its walls adorned with murals and manuscripts whose colours defied the harsh sun and relentless wind, a sanctuary that served both as a spiritual retreat and a repository of knowledge in the high, windswept reaches of western Tibet. The earliest references describe monks performing daily rituals in a courtyard of carved stone, where prayer flags fluttered in the icy gusts and small gardens somehow thrived despite the thin soil and altitude, hinting at a careful cultivation that seemed almost miraculous given the location. Scholars who have examined these texts note unusually precise descriptions of the monastery's layout, including the orientation of its halls, the placement of stupas, and the proportions of its towers, all of which suggest a structure of significant size and cultural importance, yet one that would have required extraordinary effort to construct at such a forbidding height. Travellers and pilgrims in the 18th century left sketches and travelogues that recorded Tsangon with striking detail, noting its layered terraces, the colour of its painted doors, and the intricate lattice work of windows along with its collection of rare manuscripts and ritual objects. One European explorer in 1772 described a journey up a narrow, serpentine path to a ridge where the monastery appeared unexpectedly, rising above cliffs that fell sharply into valleys below, as though suspended between earth and sky. His diary records the awe of local guides at the site and the reverence in which it was held, describing corridors lined with lamps that glowed at dusk and bell towers whose chimes carried across the mountains. These accounts, preserved in archives and monasteries, paint a picture of a thriving religious centre, yet none of the sketches or maps provides coordinates that can be confirmed with modern instruments, leaving the monastery's exact location a matter of conjecture. When geographers and explorers of the 20th century attempted to retrace the old caravan routes, the ridge appeared entirely barren, the monastery absent, leaving no foundation stones, rubble or debris to indicate where it had stood. Survey teams using aerial photography, satellite imaging and topographic mapping found no anomalies consistent with the scale of the monastery described, and even high-resolution scans failed to reveal traces of terraces, retaining walls, or gardens that might have persisted beneath snow or soil. Expedition notes mention accounts from local nomads who swear the ridge once bore walls and roofs, yet today it offers only a sheer face of rock interspersed with hardy shrubs and the occasional plateau of frozen earth. Despite the thoroughness of modern methods, Tsangon seems to have disappeared from the landscape entirely, as if the earth had reclaimed the site with deliberate precision. The surrounding cliffs and glaciers are known for their instability, yet geological analysis indicates that the ridges in this area have been comparatively stable over the past several centuries, with no signs of catastrophic avalanches, landslides or rock slides sufficient to erase an entire complex. Soil composition, erosion rates and glacial movement have been closely studied, showing minor shifts consistent with natural weathering, but nothing that could account for the total absence of foundations or structures that should have remained at least partially intact. Even remote valleys that might have served as natural repositories for displaced stones show no evidence of mass relocation, and ground-penetrating radar has failed to detect subsurface anomalies indicative of collapsed walls or buried artifacts. The geological record provides no clues, leaving the monastery's disappearance unexplained by natural forces alone. Local monks and elders recount oral histories in which Tsangon is described as a monastery capable of vanishing, a place that would appear only to those with pure intent and spiritual clarity. Legends tell of pilgrims who approached the ridge seeking refuge, only to find the monastery invisible until their minds were aligned with sacred precepts, a notion intertwined with Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, emphasizing impermanence, perception, and the elusive nature of enlightenment. These stories, while metaphorical in part, are remarkably consistent in describing the monastery's sudden absence and reappearance, suggesting that memory, ritual, and landscape are interwoven in ways that challenge conventional interpretation. Anthropologists studying these narratives note the convergence of spiritual and environmental observation, where extreme altitude, weather, and light conditions may have contributed to accounts of apparent disappearance, while reinforcing the mystical character attributed to the site. Archaeologists who have examined the region suggest that the monastery might have been deliberately dismantled or relocated, yet no records exist documenting such an event, and no nearby ruins correspond to the descriptions found in historical texts. Monastic registries, taxation documents, and travel logs make no mention of a transfer, and no accounts of war, disease or natural disaster coincide with the period of disappearance, leaving scholars with more questions than answers. Some theorists propose that smaller temporary structures could have been mistaken for a fully developed monastery, but the detailed descriptions of halls, courtyards and gardens contradict this, implying a significant permanent edifice rather than a transient site. Each investigation, combining archival research and field survey, concludes with the same unresolved reality. Tsangon existed in recorded history yet cannot be located in the present day. Despite centuries of meticulous study, satellite mapping and field expeditions, the monastery remains absent from the high Tibetan plateau, chronicled in manuscripts and pilgrim accounts, but erased from the earth as if it never existed. The ridge stands quiet, wind whipping across rock and sparse vegetation, carrying echoes of chants and bell tolls that may have persisted only in memory. Historians, geographers and spiritual scholars alike are drawn into the enigma, balancing the rigour of scientific inquiry with the poetry of legend, yet none can reconcile the rich historical record with the empty landscape encountered today. Tsangon endures as a puzzle at the intersection of history, belief and geology, a place that challenges assumptions about permanence, visibility, and the subtle interplay between human perception and the natural world. Hidden in Tibet's soaring ridges, the walls of Tsangon linger unseen, awaiting those bold enough to scale its impossible silent heights, the whispering winds of Spiti Valley, India. Travellers walking the narrow ridges of Spiti Valley have reported hearing whispers that seem to rise from the rocks themselves, voices clear enough to distinguish words, yet fading the moment one tries to follow them, leaving only the echo of human curiosity suspended in the cold, dry air. The phenomenon is most frequently observed in deep gorges and winding canyons, where sheer cliffs rise hundreds of meters above riverbeds, channeling gusts in ways that can create eerie oscillating sounds across long distances. Weeks spent traversing these high passes reveal an unsettling phenomenon. The wind sometimes carries whispers that mimic conversation, laughter, or distant calls. Every attempt to follow them fails, for the sounds dissolve just as the listener advances, leaving only the echo of a canyon's playful trickery. Scholars note that the valley's altitude, often exceeding 3,500 meters, combined with sparse vegetation and reflective rock faces, provides a natural amplifier for sound, but the regularity and clarity of these voices continue to defy conventional explanation. These occurrences are concentrated along certain sections of the valley, particularly where the terrain narrows and the river cuts sharply through limestone and sandstone ridges, forming corridors that carry and distort the wind. Geographers who have mapped the region note that temperature inversions in these high-altitude passes are common, with warm air trapped beneath cooler layers creating unusual acoustic effects that can bend and amplify sound over surprising distances. Measurements taken during field studies reveal that wind passing through specific rock formations produces low-frequency hums and modulated tones, occasionally striking intervals that bear an uncanny resemblance to human syllables. Yet while physics can account for aspects of resonance and amplification, it cannot fully explain why the sounds appear intelligible to listeners, nor why certain locations consistently produce audible words or phrases that seem directed toward those walking the paths. Historical accounts offer intriguing parallels, suggesting that the valley's mysterious voices have been noted for centuries. 17th century Tibetan Buddhist texts refer to wind voices echoing through the gorges, attributed to spirits guarding the high passes and conveying messages only to those attuned to the sacred rhythms of the mountains. Pilgrims visiting ancient monasteries in Khaza and surrounding settlements spoke of hearing guidance or warnings carried on the wind, often at times of meditation or prayer, and travellers' journals from the 18th and 19th centuries document similar experiences, emphasising both the strangeness of the phenomenon and the reverence it inspired. These historical mentions suggest that the whispers are not a recent anomaly, but rather an enduring feature of the valley, interpreted through both environmental and spiritual lenses over generations. Acoustic researchers visiting the region in recent decades have attempted to measure and record these voices with modern equipment, capturing unusual harmonic frequencies and intermittent tones in several gorges. Temperature inversions, wind velocity and cliff resonance account for some of the effects, yet recordings often reveal sounds that vary in pitch and pattern in ways inconsistent with standard acoustic models. Some listeners insist the whispers contain discernible words, forming guidance, cautions, or fragments of local phrases, though scientific verification remains elusive. The combination of physical plausibility and persistent anomaly has left investigators cautiously intrigued, acknowledging that while some aspects may be explained by natural acoustics, the consistency and intelligibility of the voices defy easy classification. In villages and monasteries alike, the phenomenon is treated as more than mere curiosity, woven into the fabric of local folklore and religious rites. Certain gorges are considered sacred, believed to house protective spirits who communicate selectively with travellers or pilgrims of good intent, and some families recount stories passed down through generations of wind-borne messages that warned of avalanches, illness, or approaching danger. Monks stationed at remote hermitages describe the whispers as carrying prayers, blessings, or guidance from ancestors, a perspective that blends the audible with the spiritual in a manner that reinforces the valley's sense of mystery. For those steeped in these traditions, the whispers are not simply natural anomalies, but a bridge between the tangible and intangible, a phenomenon where environment, human perception, and belief intersect. Every effort to capture the whispers, through recordings, amplified sound, or mechanical wind, has failed, as if the mountains themselves deny full understanding, untouched by surveys or studies. Scholars studying sound propagation at high altitudes acknowledge that unusual wind patterns, rock formations, and microclimates can create echoes, murmurs, and strange modulations, yet the precision, clarity, and persistence reported by observers remain unexplained. Field teams report that even under controlled conditions, recordings of the phenomenon often sound unintelligible until played back under the natural conditions of the gorges, suggesting a delicate interplay between environment, perception, and resonance that resists replication. Across the canyons of Spiti, the winds continue to murmur secrets that have eluded decades of study, leaving listeners unsure whether they are hearing the mountains, the echoes of ancient voices, or some enigma that lies between the known and the unknowable. The valley's combination of extreme altitude, narrow gorges, and reflective cliffs ensures that the whispers endure as both a natural curiosity and a spiritual enigma, a mystery that entices researchers, travellers, and devotees alike. Each passing season brings new reports, reinforcing the notion that the phenomenon is neither fleeting nor accidental, yet it remains as elusive and intangible as the wind itself, slipping through fingers, ears, and instruments with quiet inevitability. Through Spiti's icy silent passes, the wind whispers in voices that vanish as soon as one reaches for them. The eternal flame of Muktinath, Nepal. At the base of the high-altitude spring, flames flicker from cracks in the earth, dancing atop water so clear that the stones beneath glimmer as if lit from within, and the heat from the fire mingles strangely with the icy air of the surrounding plateau. Pilgrims trekking across rugged passes pause in reverence, some tracing the edges of the spring with hands folded, noting how the flame persists even as wind gusts sweep over the mountains, a delicate dance of fire and water that seems to defy reason. The immediate impression is one of impossible balance, a flame that does not consume the water, yet rises uninterrupted from its surface, fueled by a source invisible to casual observation, captivating both the faithful and the curious alike. For centuries, Muktinath has been considered a sacred site by both Hindus and Buddhists, and the flame itself is a central symbol of purity and eternal life. Devotees believe that its presence embodies divine energy, and legends describe the fire as a guardian that guides pilgrims through treacherous terrain and extreme weather. Monastic records recount that each year, thousands journey from distant valleys to perform rituals beside the flame, offering oil, incense, and prayers, and many claim that witnessing the flame can inspire visions or a heightened sense of awareness. Scholars who study religious practices in the Himalayas note that this dual reverence, from both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, adds layers of meaning to the site, intertwining spiritual narrative with the natural mystery of the flame itself. The spring itself is remarkable, even by Himalayan standards. Water emerges at a steady temperature that resists freezing, despite the sub-zero air that often blankets the plateau, and its flow is continuous, fed by underground channels that remain largely unexplored. Small fissures along the stream's edges emit gas, believed to be primarily methane, which ignites as it reaches the surface. Yet even with this explanation, The persistence of the flame in the face of wind, rain, and seasonal snowstorms remains difficult to account for. Observers note that during heavy storms, the flame flickers but does not extinguish, and even thin layers of ice forming around the spring seem unable to suppress it. This delicate equilibrium between fire, water, and environment has fascinated geologists and chemists for decades, challenging conventional understanding of how natural flames survive in extreme conditions. Scientific investigation has focused on the chemical composition of the water and gas emissions, as well as the mechanics of flame stability at high altitudes. Measurements indicate a continuous supply of methane mixed with other trace gases rising from subterranean fissures, providing fuel for combustion, yet researchers admit that this alone cannot fully explain the flame's steadiness over centuries. High-altitude conditions typically hinder consistent burning, with low atmospheric pressure and cold, turbulent winds making sustained flames difficult to maintain. Some studies suggest that micro-fissures and sheltered niches in the spring bed help protect the flame from the elements, but no comprehensive model has accounted for its uninterrupted presence. Each experiment seems to reveal one piece of the puzzle, only to leave another question unanswered, preserving the flame's enigmatic reputation. Etched into historical records, the traces of the phenomenon lend weight to a mystery that has defied understanding for generations. Travel journals from the 18th century describe pilgrims and explorers marvelling at the flame's resilience, noting that torches and fires nearby would often die out in storms that barely affected the eternal flame. Monks who maintained the site kept meticulous accounts of weather, water levels, and flame behaviour, suggesting awareness of the phenomenon's unusual stability. These observations imply that the flame has not merely persisted by chance, but has been a constant element of the valley's cultural and natural landscape, witnessed and revered over generations, yet never fully understood. The phenomenon itself is enriched by local legends and spiritual interpretations, which add depth to its enduring mystery. Villagers recount stories of the flame signalling important events, protecting travellers, and even responding to offerings placed in its vicinity. Some claim the flame intensifies when devotion is sincere, or that it diminishes slightly when rituals are neglected, a belief that blurs the line between natural occurrence and perceived spiritual interaction. Anthropologists studying Himalayan religious practices note that this interplay between human perception and natural phenomena is common, yet the flame at Muktinath remains one of the clearest examples where faith and observation intersect, creating a mystery that is both physical and symbolic. On the surrounding plateau, the underlying geology adds yet another layer to the spring's enduring mystery. Surveys of the area reveal a network of underground fissures and limestone caverns, through which not only gas but also warm geothermal water seeps toward the surface, maintaining the spring's steady flow. Seasonal snowmelt from the Annapurna Ranges feeds the aquifers, ensuring that the water remains clear and mineral-rich, yet the source of the methane remains partially hidden, escaping precise measurement. Pockets of naturally occurring hydrocarbons, trapped within sedimentary layers, may serve as a source of fuel according to local geologists, but the sheer steadiness of the flame over centuries, undiminished by wind or precipitation, suggests a rare and delicate geological balance. Even subtle shifts in rock composition or water chemistry could extinguish the flame, yet it endures, hinting at a subterranean system of remarkable consistency and complexity that has persisted largely untouched by human interference. Burning steadily through centuries, the eternal flame resists explanation, occupying the fragile boundary between geological processes, chemical reaction, and human belief. Its survival in a high-altitude, frigid environment above an active spring challenges expectations and draws countless visitors who hope to witness a phenomenon that merges the natural and the sacred. Researchers and pilgrims alike are left to wonder whether the flame is sustained purely by subterranean gas and geological conditions, or if there is something more subtle, something beyond measurement, that allows it to endure unchanged through time. Each gust of wind, each glimmering ripple of water serves as a reminder that even in a world of careful study, some mysteries refuse to yield their secrets. And through the thin mountain air, the flame of Muktinath burns with a quiet certainty that no logic can fully explain. The metallic ringing of Sela Pass, Arunachal Pradesh, India. As travellers ascend the winding slopes of Sela Pass, a sudden metallic resonance pierces the air, a sound unlike any bell or hammer, seemingly emanating from the rocks themselves, startling those unprepared for its clarity and persistence. The tone is high-pitched yet structured, carrying across narrow valleys and ridges in a way that makes it impossible to locate the precise source, and its sudden appearance amidst the biting Himalayan wind lends it an almost otherworldly quality. Witnesses often describe a sense of awe mixed with unease, as if the mountains themselves are speaking in a language beyond comprehension, compelling travellers to pause and strain to understand whether the sound is natural, mechanical, or something entirely unknown. Nestled at over 4,000 metres, Sela Pass is carved between ridges of metamorphic rock, with cliffs and narrow valleys that could act as natural amplifiers, projecting sounds over vast distances and shaping them into tones that resonate unnervingly with human hearing. Geological surveys have noted the presence of dense quartz and mica layers within the rock, minerals known to vibrate under certain stress conditions, suggesting a possible natural explanation for some of the harmonic quality. Yet no consistent pattern of seismic activity or temperature-induced vibration fully accounts for the persistence or timing of the ringing, leaving both geologists and mountaineers puzzled by its clarity and regularity. The pass itself is exposed to shifting winds, cold currents funneled through the gorges, and sudden temperature drops, all conditions that could influence sound propagation, yet they do not explain why the metallic resonance emerges with such distinct tonal precision. Local guides recount stories passed down for generations, describing a chime that appears at particular hours, often coinciding with northeast winds, and is regarded as a sign of the mountain's watchfulness or a forewarning of storms. Older villagers speak of shepherds and traders hearing the ringing long before modern roads were built, sometimes interpreting it as a signal to halt travel or prepare for sudden weather changes, and in some cases, associating it with omens concerning livestock or safety on the pass. Historical references in regional travelogues and military dispatches mention unaccounted-for sounds in the higher reaches of Arunachal Pradesh, noting that even experienced surveyors and troops were unsettled by tones that resembled metallic percussion, yet had no identifiable source. These records hint at a continuity of the phenomenon over centuries, reinforcing its enduring mystery beyond anecdotal perception. In their quest to capture the mysterious ringing, researchers have scrutinized the pass's geological and atmospheric conditions, utilizing vibration sensors, acoustic recorders, and temperature measurements. Data indicates that shifts in wind pressure and slight movements within mineral layers can generate oscillations, creating sounds that echo across valleys, but the instruments often fail to capture the clarity and harmonic structure reported by eyewitnesses. Even in controlled experiments, the metallic resonance either emerges intermittently or not at all, suggesting that the phenomenon requires a combination of environmental variables that is extremely difficult to reproduce artificially. Some studies propose that the interaction of wind with rock cavities may produce natural tonal frequencies, yet no single theory accounts for the precision, timing, and apparent directionality of the sounds, leaving much of the mystery unresolved. Trekking diaries from mountaineers and survey teams describe the ringing as almost purposeful, rising and fading in patterns that evoke gongs or bells, and often appearing at moments when the path is most isolated or treacherous. Those who hear it speak of an uncanny resonance that lingers in the memory, a metallic tone that seems aware of its audience, fading when approached but returning with renewed clarity moments later. Soldiers stationed along the pass during strategic surveys in the mid-20th century noted similar experiences, recording brief logs of unexplained chimes that persisted despite the absence of machinery, animals, or other identifiable sources. This human response to the sound, a mix of wonder and apprehension, reinforces the perception of the phenomenon as both tangible and elusive, something that exists at the intersection of environmental science and human interpretation. Elders in nearby villages regard the metallic ringing as the voice of the mountains, a phenomenon that communicates warnings, signals, or messages to those who traverse the high passes. Stories tell of shepherds avoiding sudden storms after hearing the chime, or travellers reconsidering dangerous crossings because the sound suggested vigilance, and many attribute the resonance to unseen spirits protecting the mountain corridors. Anthropologists studying local Himalayan traditions note that the interpretation of natural sounds as omens or spiritual messages is common, yet the metallic quality and consistent occurrence of the ringing at Sela Pass stand out as exceptional. The phenomenon blends observable natural factors with deeply rooted cultural meaning, producing a mystery that is both scientific and human, measured yet ineffable. No explanation has silenced the metallic ringing of Sela Pass, which persists decades into observation, a subtle convergence of winds, rock, and human perception that continues to perplex. Acoustic anomalies persist. Travellers report experiences that instruments cannot fully capture, and local interpretations remain intertwined with centuries of lore. The pass remains a place of quiet wonder, where the mountains hold secrets in their mineral veins and the wind carries voices that resist definition. Bouncing between narrow valleys and jagged cliffs, the metallic sound rings out crisp and deliberate, as if the mountains are still alive with intent. The disappearance of the British mountaineers on Everest, 1924. Everest's upper slopes rise sharply into a void where air is thin, temperatures plunge well below freezing, and every step demands extraordinary exertion, framing the stage for one of mountaineering's most enduring enigmas. The mountain looms with a combination of awe and danger, its ridges, ice cliffs, and deep crevasses forming a labyrinth of hazards that can erase the most careful traveller from view. Snowdrifts accumulate unpredictably on steep slopes, hidden cornices jut from frozen cliffs, and the wind cuts with a precision that makes every step precarious, creating an environment in which human presence is at once remarkable and fragile. In 1924, these heights were largely unmapped, explored only through sketches, reconnaissance, and limited surveying, making each advance a test of navigation, endurance, and survival against forces few had ever confronted. In the spring of that year, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine prepared for the ascent from their base camp with heavy wool clothing layered for warmth, thick leather boots reinforced with crampons, and an oxygen apparatus that, by modern standards, was rudimentary and difficult to manage. Their supplies were carried by porters along the lower and middle slopes, with relay camps established to facilitate gradual acclimatization to the extreme altitude. Every load of food, fuel, and equipment had to be painstakingly transported, unloaded, and secured in a way that minimized risk from avalanches, rockfall, and sudden weather changes. Even at 8,000 meters, the climbers were still dependent on improvised ladders, rope lines, and handholds carved from the ice, moving through terrain that demanded constant vigilance and tireless attention. Eyewitness accounts from lower camps describe Mallory and Irvine reaching the second step on June 8th, moving slowly but deliberately with Noel Odell, the last known observer, noting the climbers' progress during a brief clearing in the clouds. Odell recalled seeing them ascend the rock face with measured effort, seemingly pausing at ledges and then continuing upward, their movements deliberate yet burdened by exhaustion. Beyond this fleeting glimpse, the mountain reclaimed them entirely, leaving only the faint traces of footprints in the snow and the echoes of wind over the icy ridges. Subsequent teams searching the upper slopes found abandoned oxygen bottles, fragments of clothing, and pieces of a ladder, but these objects provided little explanation of the climbers' ultimate fate and no evidence of whether they reached the summit. Search expeditions in the following decades combed the northeast face and surrounding ridges, uncovering frozen equipment and occasional items that suggested their path but could not reveal the final moments. Diaries and reports from these missions emphasize the vast scale of the challenge. The mountain's slopes are riddled with hidden crevasses, steep seracs, and icefalls that shift over time, making precise tracking almost impossible. Even the most experienced surveyors and climbers were confronted by terrain that could erase evidence within hours, while sudden storms could bury tracks and scatter equipment beyond recognition. Each attempt to reconstruct the climber's journey highlighted the thin line between survival and disaster, where human determination met the relentless forces of nature. In 1999, Mallory's body was discovered at 8,155 meters on a slope, suggesting a fall during descent, preserved in ice with injuries consistent with a high-impact impact. The position of his body, the condition of his hands, and the absence of a camera that might have documented the summit left tantalizing questions unanswered. Some personal effects were recovered, including boots, clothing, and a few tools, yet Irvine's body and camera remain missing, fueling ongoing speculation about whether the two men had actually reached the summit before their fatal misfortune. Forensic analysis has examined the trajectory of the fall, possible weather conditions at the time, and injuries compatible with a combination of wind, ice, and exhaustion. but these details provide only fragments of understanding, leaving the outcome unresolved. The extreme environmental conditions of Everest amplify every hazard. Oxygen levels at the higher altitudes drop to less than a third of what humans experience at sea level, and temperatures often descend past -40 Celsius, while gusts can reach speeds over 100 km per hour. Frostbite can set in within minutes, and every movement requires extraordinary effort, with exhaustion and altitude sickness combining to impair judgment and slow reflexes. At the second step and above, narrow ledges and exposed faces leave climbers vulnerable to slips that are nearly always fatal, and even experienced mountaineers are often forced to make decisions that balance progress against the near certainty of injury or death. These factors make any ascent at this altitude a combination of human skill, endurance, and an element of chance entirely beyond control. The story of Mallory and Irvine has endured as more than a record of mountaineering ambition. It stands as a meditation on the intersection of human aspiration and the unforgiving power of nature. Their disappearance embodies the tension between exploration and risk, where courage and preparation meet environmental extremes that can erase the evidence of human effort within hours. Expeditions continue to revisit the upper slopes, employing modern technology such as drones, satellite imagery, and high-altitude cameras, yet no definitive proof exists that they reached the summit. Each new observation and artifact adds depth but rarely clarity, maintaining the mystery as part of Everest's immutable character. Amid the ice, wind and snow, the mountain has kept its secrets for over a century, preserving the memory of two climbers whose fate remains unknown, whether they reached the summit or were claimed by the heights before they could. The disappearing lake of Pumeri, Nepal. Climbers returning from their trek up Pumeri noticed something extraordinary. A calm, reflective pool had appeared where the rocky basin had once been dry, its surface mirroring the surrounding ridges and glaciers in a way that seemed almost impossible at that altitude. The lake lay at roughly 5,100 meters, its sudden presence contrasting sharply with the harsh, glaciated terrain around it, and for those who observed it, the scene carried a sense of quiet unease, as if the mountains themselves had briefly conjured water where none should exist. Initial reports were filled with amazement, but also with questions about how such a body of water could form so quickly in one of the world's most extreme environments. High-altitude photographs and satellite imagery captured the lake in mid-March, showing its swift growth fed by melting ice and runoff from surrounding slopes. Each image revealed the lake expanding over the course of weeks, its pale turquoise surface nestled in the moraines below steep ice cliffs. Researchers noted the speed of its formation, an anomaly compared with the usual slow accumulation of glacial meltwater, and the clarity of the water suggested it had recently formed from freshly melted ice, rather than prolonged accumulation of sediment-laden runoff. The lake's appearance was corroborated by multiple independent observations from climbers, adding to the credibility of what might otherwise have seemed an optical illusion on the harsh slopes of Pumeri. Weeks later, the same observers returned to find the waters had vanished completely, leaving a shallow hollow lined with ice and stone. What had been a broad and tranquil mirror was reduced to a depression, its edges etched with traces of the previous shoreline and scattered fragments of melting ice. Those who had witnessed the lake's sudden formation struggled to reconcile the disappearance with the physical landscape. There were no obvious drainage channels or evidence of an outflow, and the basin appeared largely intact, as if the water had simply evaporated or disappeared into the mountain itself. The speed and completeness of this vanishing act deepened the mystery, raising questions about unseen mechanisms beneath the surface of the glacier and moraine. Beneath Pumeri's surface, hidden channels of ice and shifting moraine create pathways that can carry water away almost invisibly, complicating any attempt to trace the lake's disappearance. Crevasses and subglacial tunnels, carved over centuries by moving ice, provide potential conduits for water to flow beneath the glacier, emerging far below the visible slope in locations impossible to survey from above. Geological surveys have documented similar features in nearby valleys, but even with modern mapping and ground-penetrating radar, the precise paths taken by water in these high-altitude systems remain speculative. The lake's sudden formation and disappearance thus highlight a phenomenon that is both natural and elusive, defying straightforward explanation while remaining consistent with the hidden complexity of Himalayan glaciers. Seasonal shifts and sudden temperature fluctuations in the high Himalayas can transform a glacier's behaviour in days, creating temporary reservoirs that vanish as quickly as they form. During the spring months, warm sunlight can accelerate the melting of surface ice while simultaneously destabilising the moraine walls that contain glacial water, causing a sudden breach or absorption into subglacial channels. Observations from nearby peaks show that meltwater can accumulate in shallow basins above hidden ice layers, forming lakes that are highly sensitive to pressure changes and ice movement. Seismic activity, minor though it may be, can further destabilise these ephemeral bodies, triggering drainage that leaves no outward trace. In Pomori's case, subtle shifts in the glacier's mass or a brief thaw could have been sufficient to allow the entire lake to vanish almost overnight, a process that modern monitoring still struggles to capture in real time. Teams visiting the site documented the void carefully, taking measurements and photographs, yet every tool failed to reveal where the water had gone. Observers noted that the depression retained the same contours as the lake's prior surface, with no signs of overflow or catastrophic drainage. Small fragments of ice clung to the edges, slowly melting under the thin sunlight, but these traces offered no clues to the water's final destination. Scientists theorized about rapid subglacial drainage, melting channels, or temporary blockage of ice dams, but each hypothesis carried uncertainties, and none could account for the complete disappearance within such a short time frame. The mountain's processes appeared deliberate yet unknowable, a fleeting act of hydrological trickery that left human understanding one step behind. Stories passed among the nearby communities suggested the mountain itself had swallowed the waters, a fleeting phenomenon that seemed to defy reason and human expectation. Local tradition often interprets sudden changes in the high mountains as signs or warnings, and the appearance and disappearance of the lake was woven into this cultural framework, adding a layer of narrative that mingled belief with observation. Tales spoke of impermanent waters and glaciers that moved silently beneath the rocks, reminding mountaineers that the terrain could hide secrets beyond the reach of instruments and maps. These cultural accounts, while not scientific, provide insight into the human perception of high-altitude phenomena and reinforce the eerie sense that the Himalayas maintain their mysteries on their own terms. Years of observation and analysis have yet to produce an explanation, leaving the lake as a silent testament to the unpredictable forces that shape the high Himalayas. Modern remote sensing continues to monitor the slopes for similar events, yet no comparable lake has reappeared in the same basin, and each investigation reveals only the complexity of glacial and subglacial systems rather than a definitive answer. The lake's brief life and total disappearance underscore the mountain's capacity to produce phenomena that are both tangible and inexplicable, observable yet fundamentally unknowable. The basin of Pomori waits silently, a hollow expanse that carries the memory of waters existing only briefly. The singing ice of Zemu Glacier, India. A low, resonant hum drifted through the Zemu Glacier Valley, rising and falling with the shifting ice and echoing off the walls of the surrounding peaks. A sound that seemed almost deliberate in its regularity, yet belonged entirely to the frozen landscape. The wind whispered across the crevasses, carrying the vibrations like the faint chords of a distant instrument, and the valley held the tones long after they had emerged, amplifying their presence in the thin, cold air. Observers described the sound as a deep, sonorous murmur, neither entirely musical nor mechanical, a voice that could be felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears, yet its origin remained elusive. Stretching more than 25 kilometers from the Kangchenjunga slopes, Zemu Glacier channels colossal volumes of ice through a labyrinth of crevasses and frozen ridges, descending from altitudes exceeding 7,500 meters toward the Teesta River basin. The glacier is the largest in Sikkim and one of the longest in the eastern Himalayas, fed by high-altitude snowfields and icefalls that move slowly but with immense weight, grinding against the rock beneath. Its surface is a maze of crevasses, seracs and ice cliffs, constantly shifting with minute movements that are almost imperceptible to the human eye but capable of producing internal stress and vibration within the ice. Instruments left at various points along the glacier recorded harmonic vibrations, revealing frequencies too regular to be produced by random cracking alone. Seismometers and high-sensitivity microphones detected long, sustained tones, sometimes rising into near-melodic intervals that carried for hundreds of meters across the ice surface. Researchers speculated that temperature fluctuations, ice fracturing, and compression of deep crevasses may allow vibrations to resonate through the glacier like a massive natural organ pipe. Even more puzzling was the timing. The tones often appeared at night, when the glacier cooled rapidly and the air was still, suggesting a connection between thermal contraction and acoustic resonance. Seasonal dynamics appear to play a critical role in this phenomenon. During spring and early summer, sunlight accelerates surface melting while ice layers beneath remain cold and brittle, creating stress differentials that could trigger harmonic vibrations. Sudden warm days followed by freezing nights create temperature gradients within the ice, forcing microscopic cracks to open and close in rhythm, potentially generating the low-frequency tones that echo through the valley. These conditions are unpredictable and rarely sustained long enough for researchers to record them consistently, making Zemu Glacier's nocturnal songs intermittent and difficult to study. Observing the mountains over many years, climbers and porters note a strange melodic resonance that seems to appear when the night is clear and the air calm. Early accounts recorded in expedition logs describe the sound as a low hum or distant bell, growing louder in some areas while vanishing entirely in others, suggesting that the glacier's shape and internal structure amplify or suppress the tones in ways that are not yet fully understood. Those who have slept near the glacier report waking at night to the vibrations, feeling an uncanny pressure in the air that accompanies the sound, as if the glacier itself were breathing or murmuring secrets. The harmonic sounds of the glacier may stem from basal sliding, internal fracturing, or ice crystal vibrations, yet no single explanation accounts for all observations. Basal sliding occurs when the glacier moves over bedrock, creating friction that can produce low-frequency sound waves. Internal fractures form in response to temperature shifts, sometimes propagating vibrations across long distances, while the geometric arrangement of ice layers can amplify certain frequencies, producing harmonic overtones. Some scientists have also suggested that underground water channels beneath the glacier could transmit and modify vibrations, adding complexity to the acoustic patterns and leaving every measurement open to interpretation. To local communities, the glacier's haunting music has long been interpreted as a message from the mountains, a natural voice imbued with spiritual significance. Sikkimese folklore describes the tones as the whispering of mountain spirits or guardians, a reminder that the high peaks possess a consciousness beyond human understanding. Traders and pilgrims travelling near the glacier recount stories of the ice's song guiding them at night, warning of unstable slopes, or signalling the presence of hidden crevasses, blending practical observation with legend in a way that echoes the mystery itself. Even the wildlife appears affected by the phenomenon. Snow leopards, Himalayan tahr and red pandas that inhabit the lower reaches of the glacier valley reportedly change their movement patterns during nights when the hum is strongest, avoiding the areas where the acoustic vibrations are concentrated. While such reports remain largely anecdotal, they suggest that the glacier's sounds are not merely perceivable to humans, but are also a physical presence within the environment, subtly altering behaviour in ways that have yet to be quantified. Scientific teams continue to monitor the glacier with recording devices, drones, and temperature sensors, yet the harmonic vibrations remain sporadic and unpredictable, challenging every attempt at full explanation. Long-term climate monitoring indicates that temperature swings, snowfall, and ice movement all influence the conditions under which the sounds emerge, but no set of parameters has produced a reliable forecast. Each expedition reveals the glacier's immense complexity: layers of compressed ice, hidden crevasses, and flowing meltwater beneath the surface that may carry or dampen vibrations in ways only partially understood. Zemu Glacier's nocturnal harmonics continue to baffle observers, rising and falling through the Himalayan night despite modern technology and decades of study, a voice of ice that defies comprehension. The Frozen Caravan of Leh, India. When the frozen caravan emerged from the drifting snow near Leh, it seemed to have been transported from another century, untouched and unnervingly intact. Figures of men, women, and pack animals were preserved mid-stride, their expressions frozen in a haunting stillness, as if the passage of time had abruptly halted for them alone. Supplies and merchandise, including salt, wool, and small metal goods, remained stacked on the animals' backs, covered lightly by frost but showing no signs of decay or scavenging, a level of preservation that immediately puzzled both local villagers and visiting investigators. The high-altitude passes surrounding Leh are notorious for sudden blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, a landscape where life and death often coexist in precarious balance. At altitudes exceeding 3,500 meters, the air is thin, the sun is harsh during the day, and the temperature can drop rapidly at night, creating conditions where a traveller unprepared for a storm could succumb within hours. Snowfields stretch for kilometers between jagged ridges, and avalanche-prone slopes guard the routes that caravans historically followed. Even seasoned mountaineers regard the region with caution, making the frozen caravan's immaculate condition all the more extraordinary. Caravans like these once formed the backbone of trade across Ladakh, carrying goods between remote Himalayan villages and Central Asia for centuries. Salt from the high plateaus, wool from yaks, dried fruits, and occasionally precious items like silver or turquoise would traverse the passes, connecting otherwise isolated communities. Historical records describe caravan convoys sometimes numbering several dozen animals and traders, moving slowly to conserve strength and avoid treacherous terrain, with guides familiar with hidden passes and seasonal snow patterns. Yet, for all the documentation of these journeys, none describe a disappearance that would leave every member frozen in place, untouched by frostbite, injury, or the natural decay that would normally follow death in such extreme conditions. Investigators who approached the site were struck by the astonishing condition of the travellers and animals, frozen mid-step as if time itself had chosen to suspend the moment for all eternity. Hands were clenched on reins, faces tilted toward the wind, eyes wide in what appeared to be surprise or fear, yet without any physical evidence of trauma. The pack animals, primarily yaks and mules, remained tethered in formation, as though still responding to the commands of unseen handlers. Even the goods on their backs appeared undisturbed, the textiles retaining their fibres and colours despite the snow and ice that had accumulated over them. Glaciologists and climatologists examined the ice surrounding the caravan, considering rapid burial, unique snow chemistry, and sudden temperature drops, yet no single factor fully explained the phenomenon. The snow layers revealed alternating periods of wind-driven compaction and frost, which could theoretically encase objects quickly, but similar conditions elsewhere did not produce the same exceptional preservation. Laboratory tests on water content in the ice indicated that the snow had partially melted and refrozen multiple times, a process that normally damages organic material, but in this instance seemed to have contributed to a form of natural cryogenic stabilization. Ancient trade logs and local chronicles reference caravans lost to sudden storms, particularly during late autumn when early blizzards could catch travelers off guard, yet none describe a disappearance so complete or a preservation so absolute. Records mention bodies recovered months later, but always with evidence of frostbite or post-mortem decay. In the case of the frozen caravan near Leh, the complete absence of bodily deterioration suggested either an extraordinarily rapid freezing event or environmental conditions entirely unlike anything recorded in surrounding valleys. Communities in the area speak of the frozen travellers in hushed tones, weaving the event into folklore that frames it as a warning from the mountains, or a glimpse of forces beyond human comprehension. Elders recount tales of caravans swallowed by sudden storms, only to reappear years later as statues of ice, their existence serving as a reminder of the mountain's dominance over human endeavour. Some villagers believe that the spirits of the travellers linger in the passes, guiding lost animals or protecting those who tread carefully, while others insist that the frozen caravan represents an encounter with forces that defy ordinary natural law. Forensic studies have attempted to identify the cause of death, examining tissue, clothing, and the composition of the snow surrounding the caravan. Preliminary findings suggest that hypothermia set in almost instantly, yet without any visible struggle or defensive injuries. Snow density measurements and ice layering indicate that the caravan may have been enveloped by a sudden drift or micro-avalanche that rapidly froze the travellers and animals alike, a phenomenon rare even in these high mountains. Despite these analyses, no experiment has been able to reproduce the combination of speed, precision, and completeness observed at the site. Enduring through decades and centuries, the frozen caravan captivates historians, mountaineers, and scientists, standing as a testament to the mountain's silent secrets. Expeditions attempt to study it under carefully controlled conditions, using drones, ice-penetrating radar, and climate sensors to gather data without disturbing the fragile scene. Each approach reveals new anomalies, minor shifts in the ice that suggest the glacier's movement, faint traces of snowmelt channels that could influence preservation, and subtle variations in frost patterns that hint at the microclimate's complexity. Every discovery raises further questions, reinforcing the notion that the phenomenon is not only rare but perhaps unique in the entire Himalayan region. Silent and frozen near Leh, the caravan resists explanation, its preserved state holding the chill and the mystery of centuries untouched by science. The figures frozen in ice, the animals perfectly posed, and the untouched merchandise all suggest a moment suspended between natural forces and something beyond ordinary comprehension, a scene both historical and inexplicably otherworldly. The caravan endures in the silent snow, a ghostly tableau of life abruptly halted, challenging anyone who dares to uncover the truth behind its frozen stillness. The moving shadows of Tso Moriri, India. Dark, human-shaped silhouettes glide silently across a frozen surface, appearing and vanishing without a trace, leaving no footprints to mark their passage. They move with deliberate intent, yet evade any attempt at pursuit, drifting against the wind and fading into the dimming light as if the ice itself refuses their presence. Witnesses first noticed them during the coldest months, when the world seemed suspended between daylight and the long Himalayan night, and the stillness is so profound that even a whisper carries for miles. The figures are not shadows cast by trees or rocks, nor illusions of the setting sun. They possess form, purpose, and an eerie elusiveness that has confounded both locals and scientists for decades. Shepherds moving yaks along the frozen expanse spoke of these figures long before modern study, describing them as tall, thin silhouettes with human-like posture but no features, gliding across ice that should have betrayed their weight. They pause at times, seeming to observe, then continue into the distance, fading as though absorbed by the cold air. Even when approached cautiously, the shapes vanish completely, leaving only the sharp, clean surface of the ice behind. Observers often report a sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking their movements, creating an atmosphere of quiet, unshakable unease. Local folklore gives these apparitions a name: LHA, the spirits of the mountains, said to wander the high plateaus, testing those who venture too far. Nomadic families avoid the area at twilight, believing that direct pursuit invites misfortune or disorientation among the frozen ridges. In these tales, the shadows are both warning and guide, their elusive presence reminding humans of forces beyond comprehension. Consistent descriptions from decades of eyewitnesses suggest that Tso Moriri has long functioned as a liminal space, a threshold where the natural and the unseen intersect. Scientific interest in the phenomenon intensified in the late 20th century. The frozen lake is part of a high-altitude wetland ecosystem, recognized as a Ramsar site for its ecological significance. Its turquoise waters sustain rare species like the black-necked crane, Grus nigricolis, along with numerous migratory waterfowl, and its fragile environment draws researchers and conservationists alike. During winter, the lake freezes over, forming a deceptive sheet of ice that can reach over a meter thick, and the extreme stillness of the surroundings creates conditions in which even the faintest movement seems amplified. Remote cameras occasionally captured fleeting silhouettes, though the figures always disappeared when approached, confounding any attempt at physical verification. In 1998, one of the most notable scientific observations took place when mountaineer and filmmaker Tashi Namgyal spent a week monitoring the ice. He recorded human-shaped shadows moving along paths that mirrored trails to sacred sites, including the 14th century Korzok monastery on the northern shore. The pattern suggested intent, almost as if the shadows followed an ancient memory embedded in the landscape itself. Attempts to explain the shapes as light refraction, optical illusions, or atmospheric distortion fell short, particularly because the figures often appeared on overcast days or after sunset, when sunlight could not cast shadows. The shadow's persistence unsettles those who witness them. Accounts describe the figures moving alongside travelers for kilometers, maintaining distance and vanishing only when observers attempt to approach. Hypoxia and psychological effects of high-altitude conditions could play a role, yet descriptions from seasoned mountaineers and local guides consistently match those of untrained witnesses, implying a phenomenon that exceeds human perception limits alone. Geologically, the lake is endorheic, with no outlet, surrounded by moraines and talus slopes that funnel glacial melt into the basin. In winter, cracks and uneven ice make crossing treacherous, yet the shadows traverse these areas without incident, moving in ways that defy known physical constraints. Some researchers have suggested thermal inversions, wind-blown fog, or ice distortions as explanations, yet none account for the humanoid forms that deliberately avoid observers and exhibit movement that suggests consciousness. Even thermal imaging has recorded the figures as colder than their surroundings, adding another layer of mystery. The phenomenon intersects with spirituality as well. Monks at Korzok Monastery recount travellers guided away from dangerous areas of thin ice, interpreting the shadows as protective or instructive forces. Some locals perceive them as visual echoes of past ceremonies, rituals, or human activity, as though the lake itself retains memory of those who once traversed its surface. These interpretations blend natural observation with folklore, creating a space where cultural memory, ecology, and unexplained phenomena converge. Through drones, night vision lenses, GPS tracking, and seismic instruments, researchers have glimpsed the shadows, yet the mountain keeps its presence unconfirmed. Objects left on the ice, rocks, sticks, even personal items, remain untouched, while the shadows pass by without altering their surroundings. Observers note that GPS markers sometimes record sudden, impossible shifts, as if the figures occupy a space outside conventional geometry. Every attempt at categorization or measurement has fallen short, leaving researchers with more questions than answers. Isolation amplifies the mystery. The lake is remote, reachable only via long treks across high passes such as Pangong and Rumpsi, with winter temperatures regularly dropping below -20 degrees Celsius. The combination of altitude, cold, and vast frozen terrain heightens awareness of every movement, every change in shadow and light. Witnesses describe a slowing of time, an acute sense of presence, and an unavoidable focus on the figures gliding just out of reach. In this environment, the moving shadows become an unavoidable, almost hypnotic presence. Where scientific methods meet folklore and human perception, the shadows remain unclassified, defying understanding. They're observed yet untouchable, documented yet inexplicable, and each encounter leaves an indelible impression that lingers long after travellers have descended to lower valleys. For decades, the phenomenon has resisted all conventional explanations, existing at the crossroads of natural law and the unknown, where physics, psychology, and cultural memory intersect but fail to converge. At night, as darkness creeps over the ice, the silhouettes drift once more, tracing paths that no human could follow and leaving a silence that seems to hold its breath. The Fireballs of Arun Valley, Nepal. The Arun River snakes through a canyon so deep that sunlight reaches its waters only briefly each day, and the cliffs echo with the winds that sweep relentlessly from the Tibetan plateau. Snow-laden peaks loom above the valley, their slopes carved by glaciers and streaked with jagged rock faces that glint faintly at dusk. Life in this remote region is sparse. Shepherds guide yaks along narrow trails, and small villages cling to terraces carved into the mountainsides, their prayer flags fluttering against the bitter gusts. In such isolation, the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the valley itself seems to hold its breath when the season turns cold and the nights deepen into a silence that is absolute. On certain nights, pale spheres of light rise from the valley floor, floating silently above the river before dissolving into darkness, leaving witnesses unsure whether they saw fire, fog, or something altogether different. The balls of light appear in clusters or singly, drifting along the gorge at varying speeds, sometimes hovering for minutes, sometimes darting unpredictably before vanishing without a trace. They emit no sound, and their glow ranges from a soft amber to an intense, almost blinding white, illuminating the edges of the cliffs for fleeting moments. Travellers who have encountered them describe a feeling of otherworldly presence, a quiet tension that sharpens the senses while leaving the imagination powerless to comprehend what has been seen. Villagers speak of the lights in hushed tones, describing them as messengers of unseen forces or signs of the valley's hidden power, stories passed down through generations of traders and herders. Children are told to avoid wandering near the river at night, lest they draw the attention of the fireballs, and some elders insist that the lights appear only when the valley senses intrusion by those unprepared to witness its mysteries. While superstition frames the phenomenon, the consistency of descriptions, height, movement, luminosity and timing suggests an observable occurrence rather than pure imagination, a fact that has drawn both fascination and caution from those who live among the cliffs. Meteorologists and atmospheric scientists have attempted to explain the phenomenon as ball lightning, static discharge, or rare reflections of moonlight on mist, yet observations defy conventional models. The high-altitude conditions of the Arun Valley produce strong electrical fields and rapid temperature fluctuations, but no recorded event matches the sphere's repeated behaviour and specific trajectories. Field studies using cameras, thermal sensors and portable spectrometers have captured fleeting glows, yet even when the lights appear in controlled observation zones, their origins remain impossible to verify. Each study confirms the light's existence, but leaves their cause unresolved, straddling the line between the natural and the inexplicable. Historical travellers recorded the mysterious illumination long before modern cameras existed, noting that the fireballs often appeared along predictable stretches of the river, but vanished without a trace. Early Himalayan explorers wrote of luminous orbs that rose from the depths of the canyon and danced above the river in silence, observations that mirror modern accounts almost exactly. Even merchant caravans traversing the salt and yak routes spoke of strange lights at night, sometimes interpreted as warnings, as omens of fortune, yet consistently leaving no physical evidence behind. The continuity of these reports over centuries reinforces the idea that the phenomenon is neither recent nor isolated, but a persistent feature of the Arun Valley's landscape. The narrow gorge, carved over millennia by glacial melt and monsoon-fed rivers, creates microclimates where temperature inversions, wind shear, and humidity converge in ways rarely seen at lower altitudes. The interaction of these factors may contribute to optical distortions or transient plasma formations, yet such explanations cannot account for the precise, human-like timing and movement patterns that multiple observers report. The cliffs, icy ledges, and snow-covered ridges also amplify reflections and shadows, creating a natural stage for the lights to appear more dramatic, yet the spheres remain distinct from any background reflection or atmospheric anomaly. Luminous spheres have been reported by multiple observers, moving across the high passes in patterns that suggest intent rather than random fluctuation, despite the challenges of thin air and sub-zero nights. Guides who have spent decades traversing the valley describe how the lights follow predictable arcs along the river, occasionally retreating or circling observers, creating the impression of interaction. Scientists note that hypoxia can impair vision and perception, yet the phenomenon's consistency among both locals and trained mountaineers who are accustomed to high-altitude conditions indicates that the fireballs are unlikely to be hallucinatory or solely perceptual in nature. Cameras, thermal imaging and satellite observation have all captured fleeting glows, yet no device has ever confirmed a source, and the spheres remain elusive to measurement. Attempts to replicate their appearance in laboratory simulations have failed, and while some researchers suggest plasma discharge or piezoelectric effects from stressed rock, these theories remain speculative. The fireballs seem to exist at the intersection of measurable physical conditions and something beyond conventional understanding, an element of the valley that refuses to be pinned down by observation, logic, or technology. Fireball sightings sometimes align with local rituals and seasonal festivals, and shamans describe the lights as guardians of the valley, appearing when humans enter sacred spaces. Offerings of incense and prayer flags are sometimes left near observation points, though no correlation between ritual and the appearance of lights has been conclusively documented. For the inhabitants of Arun Valley, the fireballs are simultaneously natural marvels and spiritual signs, reminders that the landscape carries memory, power, and secrets inaccessible to outsiders. Armed with all tools and knowledge, scientists and villagers alike confront a puzzle that refuses to be solved, leaving the valley cloaked in the stillness of the unexplained. The lights appear, vanish, and persist, bridging centuries of human observation, folklore, and scientific inquiry, and remaining as distant and untouchable as the mountains themselves. As darkness falls over the frozen riverbed, a solitary fireball rises, drifting into the night where no eye can follow it. The vanished kingdom of Guga, Western Tibet. Founded in the 10th century by Ngari Khorsum, The kingdom of Guga rose in western Tibet as a bastion of culture, art and devotion. Its walls and monasteries perched atop cliffs that overlooked winding trade routes connecting distant valleys. The kingdom flourished for centuries, its rulers cultivating intricate architecture, vibrant frescoes, and a network of monasteries that became centres of Buddhist learning. Traders and pilgrims passing through marvelled at the sophistication of its stone structures, while the windswept terraces above the canyon bore witness to a civilization that thrived in one of the most remote and challenging regions of the Himalayas. In the courts and temples of Guga, life unfolded with ritual precision. Monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, artisans painted vivid murals depicting both spiritual narratives and everyday life, and marketplaces bustled with goods from far-off regions. Silk, salt and grains flowed along mountain passes, sustaining the kingdom while connecting it to neighbouring realms. The plateau's harsh climate, with its bitter winters and thin air, demanded resilience, yet the people of Guga adapted, constructing granaries, irrigation systems, and stone dwellings that still stand silent but intact centuries later. The kingdom's wealth and devotion endure in the monasteries crowning the cliffs, where frescoes remain astonishingly preserved against the ravages of time. Scenes of ritual, commerce and royal life are etched in vivid colour, a testament to a society that valued both spiritual practice and worldly prosperity. Scholars studying the murals note influences from India, Central Asia and even China, revealing a kingdom that, despite its isolation, maintained extensive cultural and religious connections across the region. Libraries hidden within the monasteries once held scrolls and texts chronicling Buddhist philosophy, astronomy and regional lore, many written in both Tibetan and Sanskrit scripts that reveal the kingdom's scholarly reach. Artisans experimented with pigments sourced from distant regions, blending mineral and plant-based dyes to produce colours that have endured centuries of wind and sunlight. Evidence of elaborate water systems, terraced agriculture and advanced masonry further underscores a civilization that combined spiritual devotion with remarkable practical ingenuity, suggesting a society as sophisticated in daily life as it was in ritual and art. Yet for all its achievements, Guga vanished almost overnight. Archaeological surveys reveal settlements abandoned in haste, granaries still stocked, households untouched, and treasures left behind as if their owners intended to return the following day. Defensive walls show no signs of battle, and records indicate no epidemic sweeping through the region at the time. The abrupt emptiness of towns and monasteries raises questions that historians and archaeologists have long struggled to answer, as the disappearance of an entire civilization without a trace of violence or decay remains unparalleled in Himalayan history. Trade and commerce, once the lifeblood of the kingdom, abruptly ceased. Caravan routes over mountain passes that had carried goods, ideas and pilgrims now fell silent. Letters, coins and artifacts left behind suggest a population that vanished suddenly, without warning or preparation. Scholars examining the ruins note the paradox. A thriving society, fully equipped for survival in harsh terrain, deserted entirely without evidence of external threat or internal collapse. Even centuries later, the emptiness feels deliberate, a calculated departure that leaves the imagination grasping for reason. Several theories attempt to explain the vanishing, yet none satisfy the full scope of the evidence. Some propose famine or climate shifts that force the population to relocate, while others speculate on political upheaval or conflict with neighbouring territories. Yet physical traces of violence, mass graves or migration are absent, leaving the mystery unresolved. Every plausible explanation collides with the stubborn fact that the kingdom's inhabitants left behind everything that could sustain life, as if the people themselves were swept away by forces beyond human understanding. Legends and oral traditions add further layers to the enigma. Tibetan elders tell of nights when lights appeared over the empty courtyards, of shadows that moved where no human stood, and of spirits guiding those who ventured too close to the ruins. These stories, repeated for generations, blend cultural memory with the unexplainable, preserving a sense of the kingdom's presence long after the population disappeared. The whispered tales frame the disappearance as more than a historical event, suggesting the intervention of unseen forces or a purposeful retreat from mortal eyes. Modern exploration has uncovered fragments of the kingdom's former glory. Archaeologists and travellers in the 20th century documented monasteries still bearing murals, statues partially intact, and inscriptions that hint at daily life, religious practice, and governance. Dust-covered courtyards, collapsed roofs, and weathered stone structures provide a tangible connection to the civilization that once thrived here, yet the absence of people continues to baffle. Even with careful excavation, the reasons for Guga's sudden abandonment remain elusive, leaving researchers with evidence of life but no clue to its abrupt end. The paradox of Guga persists. A civilization built atop cliffs, rich in culture and resources, disappears in a way that defies conventional explanation. Its monasteries, frescoes, and marketplaces tell stories of devotion, commerce, and human ingenuity, yet the absence of its people transforms these achievements into ghostly reminders of mortality and impermanence. The kingdom exists both as an archaeological treasure and as a puzzle, a space where history meets mystery, and where every ruin invites questions that may never be answered. Through the empty halls and courtyards, the wind still drifts centuries later, carrying the faint echoes of lives that disappeared too quickly to comprehend. The hidden script of Dolpo, Nepal. Deep within the remote cliffs of Dolpo, explorers uncovered caves whose walls were lined with manuscripts written in a language that defied every scholar's understanding. The discovery was accidental. A thin crevice in the rock revealed stacked bundles of fragile parchment, sealed in clay jars and covered in dust, untouched for centuries. Immediately, researchers noticed the symbols were unlike any known Tibetan script, composed of angular characters interspersed with curious loops and markings that hinted at complex grammar or coding. The air in the cave was cold and dry, preserving the delicate pages while amplifying the sense that these texts had been intentionally hidden from human eyes. The fragile parchments, preserved in cold, dry air, bear intricate symbols etched with ink derived from minerals and plant pigments, some fading yet remarkably intact after centuries. Each scroll carries a distinctive pattern, with margins often annotated in small characters that suggest explanations or cross-references. The cave walls themselves show traces of painted illustrations, faint depictions of mountains, rivers, and figures that seem to interact with the script, hinting at a narrative or instructional purpose. The combination of written language and visual art suggests a culture that valued both literacy and symbolic representation, though the meaning of the text remains elusive. Carbon dating revealed a startling anomaly. Certain texts predate the earliest known settlements in the region, suggesting knowledge and literacy far older than Dolpo's documented history. The oldest manuscripts, analysed through radiocarbon testing, point to an age that challenges accepted timelines of the Himalayan plateau's human habitation. This discrepancy forces historians to reconsider what civilizations or transient populations might have existed here long before the kingdoms and monasteries traditionally recorded in Tibetan history. The anomaly deepens when comparing these manuscripts to nearby discoveries, none of which display similar language or formatting, leaving Dolpo's hidden script an isolated enigma. The content ranges from ritual incantations to administrative notes, including symbols and patterns that do not correspond to any known Himalayan script, hinting at a civilization or knowledge system lost to time. Some passages seem to catalogue resources or record calendrical observations, while others appear to describe ceremonies or rites whose purpose is no longer discernible. The interplay of mundane and sacred content within the same scrolls suggests a society that integrated daily life and spiritual practice seamlessly, offering glimpses of a culture highly organised yet intentionally opaque to outsiders. Linguists have pored over the symbols, proposing links to Proto-Tibetan, Sanskrit, and even Central Asian trade scripts, yet every attempt at translation leaves gaps that deepen the mystery. The lack of a Rosetta Stone or bilingual text prevents definitive interpretation, and comparative analysis with neighbouring regions yields only partial correlations. Researchers speculate that the language may represent a hybrid or isolated system, developed for local use or ceremonial purposes, emphasizing secrecy or exclusivity. Every effort to decode it illuminates patterns, but never provides clarity, reinforcing the sense that the script was meant to be partially inaccessible. Monks and itinerant traders have long whispered of the manuscript's power, suggesting that only the attentive or the worthy can glimpse their meaning without inviting misfortune. Stories circulate of travellers who entered the caves seeking knowledge, only to leave disoriented or shaken, claiming that the symbols seem to move or shift under their gaze. These tales, often dismissed as folklore, gain weight when multiple independent accounts converge on similar experiences: sightings of faintly glowing text, subtle sounds accompanying page-turning, or sudden chills that descend upon those reading. The oral tradition frames the manuscripts as living objects, bridging material culture with the perception of an almost conscious presence. The caves themselves are hidden along jagged cliffs, accessible only by narrow paths, and their positioning indicates deliberate selection, shielding the manuscripts from wind, water, and the passage of centuries. The rocky approach ensures that only determined individuals can reach the entrance, while the overhanging cliffs and deep recesses protect the contents from rain, sun, and seasonal snowmelt. Archaeologists note that the careful placement of jars and scrolls demonstrates foresight, suggesting that whoever hid them intended their preservation for generations, whether for devotion, secrecy, or continuity of knowledge. Every technique, from infrared scanning to microscopic ink analysis, has revealed detail but no clarity, leaving the manuscript's origin, purpose, and authorship shrouded in uncertainty. Spectral imaging uncovers faint pigments, ultraviolet light reveals erased or overwritten characters, and digital reconstruction attempts to align fragmentary scrolls, yet none of these methods provides interpretive certainty. The manuscripts resist classification, their markings defying phonetic, symbolic, and numeric conventions, leaving scholars to grapple with the possibility that they represent a system entirely disconnected from known Himalayan cultures. In modern times, researchers and devotees alike revere the caves, moving cautiously among brittle scrolls whose existence challenges assumptions about literacy, scholarship, and cultural exchange in the high Himalayas. Expeditions document the fragile texts meticulously, photographing, scanning, and transcribing what they can, while maintaining respect for local spiritual practices. Pilgrims leave offerings at the cave entrance, acknowledging the manuscript's perceived sacredness. And scientists often collaborate with local guides to ensure minimal disturbance. The dual role of the caves as both scholarly treasure and spiritual locus underscores the tension between human curiosity and reverence for what may be unknowable. The manuscripts remain sealed in their cliffs, partially revealed to human eyes, yet ultimately preserving a mystery that is as much about the past as it is about what remains forever beyond understanding. The unexplained heat in Gyanganj Springs, India. Even amid piercing mountain winds and sub-zero air, the waters of Gyanganj rise in warmth, sending curling steam into the chill and defying every expectation. Travellers often step cautiously into the shallow pools, immediately aware of a sensation that feels both comforting and disorienting, as if the warmth pulses beneath the stones, resisting any attempt to trace its origin. The contrast between icy air and the consistently hot water produces a delicate mist that drifts across the surface, reflecting jagged peaks in fractured shapes, giving the impression that the mountains themselves exhale heat. Visitors stepping into the pools report a sensation that is both comforting and uncanny, as if the heat carries a vitality that transcends ordinary thermal activity. Trekkers recount that their bodies relax more quickly than expected, while others describe a subtle awareness or alertness as though the water stimulates more than mere muscles. Some note that immersion in the pools evokes a quiet clarity of mind, a momentary sense that the heat contains a memory of the landscape, a presence lingering long after they leave. Sages, monks, and local villagers speak of the springs with reverence, describing ancient rituals and blessings tied to the water's persistent warmth. Oral traditions recount that the pools have existed for centuries, their heat unchanged even through harsh winters or unrelenting snowfalls, making them sites of pilgrimage for meditation, cleansing, and reflection. The waters are considered sacred in some local beliefs, a gift from unseen forces that link the human spirit to the mountain's enduring secrets. Scientific teams have analysed mineral deposits, measured water temperatures, and scanned the surrounding rock, yet no magma or geothermal source sufficiently explains the phenomenon. Water temperatures often exceed 35 degrees Celsius, remarkably consistent throughout the year, and steam rises even when ambient temperatures drop far below freezing. Geologists note traces of sulfur, calcium, and iron in the water, common in Himalayan rock formations, but none provide enough energy to sustain the heat. Subsurface surveys and infrared imaging have revealed no hidden volcanic vents or geothermal fractures that could account for the anomaly, leaving Gyanganj as an enduring geological puzzle. Travellers and explorers over centuries have documented the springs, noting their anomalous warmth and integrating the pools into trade route rest stops and pilgrimage accounts. Early records describe caravans halting near the waters, marvelling that steam could rise above a river frozen solid nearby. Chronicles of Himalayan trade note that these pools offered both physical relief and a spiritual interlude during arduous mountain crossings, and that observers often sensed something inexplicable in the air. The water, a subtle hum or movement that seemed to emanate from the heat itself. Around the pools, mosses cling to rock faces and small mammals gather near the edges, creating an oasis of life in a harsh alpine environment, sustained by the spring's enigmatic heat. Hardy alpine grasses thrive where otherwise only stone and snow persist, and birds are drawn to the misty edges even during the coldest months. Observers have noted that the microclimate around the spring allows plants to flower weeks earlier than in neighbouring valleys, suggesting the warmth influences local ecology in subtle but persistent ways, reinforcing the impression that the water's energy reaches beyond simple warmth. While other Himalayan hot springs follow predictable geothermal patterns, Gyanganj's waters remain inexplicably warm, rising higher and persisting longer than comparable pools at similar altitudes. Other regional springs correlate closely with volcanic or tectonic activity, displaying clear energy sources beneath the surface, yet Gyanganj lacks such indicators entirely. The anomaly becomes more remarkable when considering the altitude, which ranges from 1,800 to 2,400 meters, where cold conditions should render subsurface heating insufficient to maintain such consistent warmth year-round. Despite repeated measurements, hydrological modelling and chemical analysis, no explanation satisfies all the observed anomalies, leaving scientists to speculate and theorise without resolution. Hypotheses ranging from deep aquifers to slow chemical reactions have been tested, yet calculations fail to reproduce the observed temperatures. Seasonal snowmelt, glacial runoff and river inflows appear to dilute rather than heat the water, while laboratory simulations cannot account for the uniformity and endurance of the warmth. Each expedition uncovers new details about mineral composition or microcurrents, but only deepens the sense that the phenomenon lies just beyond human comprehension. Today, trekkers follow narrow mountain paths to witness the steaming waters firsthand, while researchers continue meticulous observation and data collection, each expedition adding new details but no definitive answers. Wooden stairways and stone markers help preserve fragile terrain while guiding visitors, and portable instruments capture thermographs, mineral analysis and flow rates in real time. Even with modern technology, the spring resists explanation, maintaining its mystery as pilgrims and scientists alike watch steam drift into the Himalayan chill, aware that the warmth is a presence both tangible and intangible. The springs endure, their warmth a quiet paradox, hinting at forces still beyond human understanding. The shadow people of Mount Everest's death zone. At altitudes above 8,000 meters, where oxygen levels drop to roughly a third of what they are at sea level, and temperatures plunge to life-threatening lows of -30 degrees Celsius, the death zone of Mount Everest becomes a landscape where every step is a battle for survival. Climbers navigate jagged ridges, fragile ice bridges, and sudden crevasses, their breaths shallow and laborious, while the wind cuts through layers of protective clothing as if testing the limits of human endurance. In this realm, even a minor misstep can be fatal, and the sheer isolation amplifies every sensation, making shadows and shapes on the ice both compelling and uncertain. Even amid these extremes, climbers have reported seeing figures, dark, human-shaped and gliding across ice fields, vanishing the moment they are directly observed. Some describe them as standing just beyond their field of vision, moving with purpose yet leaving no footprints, no trace in snow or frost. Others speak of these silhouettes appearing near sudden slopes or precarious ledges, as if anticipating a misstep or intervening to guide them away from danger, though the phenomenon dissolves before it can be measured or touched. Expedition logs from the 1950s and 1980s describe companions who appeared on treacherous ridges, moving silently and sometimes guiding climbers away from unseen hazards. One entry from a 1980 ascent recounts a team member who, exhausted and hypothermic, saw a figure emerge from the drifting snow, gesturing toward a safe path before disappearing behind a jagged ridge. Even the 1953 British expedition, which first summited Everest, included notes of fleeting shadows glimpsed at dawn, lingering only long enough to be seen before vanishing into the pale light of ice and snow. These accounts, recorded independently by multiple expeditions, echo through the decades, forming a mysterious tapestry of experiences that remain unexplained. Sherpa guides speak in reverent tones of Nangpa, spirits inhabiting the highest reaches, sometimes protective, sometimes merely present, reminding travellers that the mountain is sovereign. These guardians are said to watch over climbers, intervening during sudden storms or when missteps threaten life, yet they are invisible to those unprepared or unobservant. For generations, these stories have been passed orally, emphasizing both caution and respect. The death zone is a sacred space, and encounters with its unseen inhabitants are rare but momentous. Severe hypoxia, sleep deprivation, frostbite, and dehydration impair cognition and perception, creating conditions where the mind can conjure shapes in the corner of vision. Research into high-altitude physiology explains that prolonged oxygen deprivation can produce vivid hallucinations, yet the consistency of reports across independent teams challenges the notion that all sightings are purely neurological phenomena. Many climbers insist that what they saw carried purpose and timing impossible to attribute entirely to exhaustion or imagination, and they recount it with the certainty of those who have narrowly survived the mountain's extremes. Atmospheric phenomena, reflections, drifting ice, fractured sunlight, and auroras could create illusions that seem eerily human, especially in blizzard or whiteout conditions. Sunlight bending across ice crystals produces shifting shadows, while swirling snow can create the impression of motion at the edge of perception. Still, witnesses emphasize the intelligence of these figures, pauses, gestures, and positioning that appear calculated, responding to human movement with apparent intent rather than randomness. One climber noted that a figure paused exactly at the edge of a fissure, as if ensuring the team's safety before vanishing into the whitened expanse. Fleeting blurs are captured by modern expeditions using infrared cameras, drones, and GPS mapping, yet they vanish before analysis can confirm their nature. Some frames show vertical shapes, briefly hovering along ridges, while sensors record subtle thermal anomalies inconsistent with known human or animal presence. Researchers remain cautious, documenting the events without drawing firm conclusions. Yet the recurrence of these blurs reinforces the possibility that something moves within the death zone, imperceptible to the unaided eye. Across decades, these figures appear with consistent height, posture, and timing, often when climbers are most exhausted or disoriented, suggesting a phenomenon that transcends individual imagination. Whether on sunlit slopes or in the shadow of overhanging ice walls, the silhouettes maintain a spatial awareness that challenges both psychological and environmental explanations. This repetition across time, altitude, and expedition team composition gives the sightings a disquieting coherence, hinting at a presence tied not just to geography, but to human vulnerability in extreme conditions. Despite careful study, the patterns defy explanation. Some shadows follow, others retreat, and none leave traces, blurring the line between hallucination, natural illusion, and something unknown. Climbers report that even those skeptical of spirits or superstition find themselves unsettled, aware that the figures operate on rules that are invisible yet seemingly consistent. Technology captures fragments, photographs show smudges, and infrared detects movement, but no measurement fully accounts for their behaviour, leaving each observer with both evidence and doubt. High in the death zone, where survival is uncertain, oxygen is scarce, and vision is easily deceived, these shadow companions linger at the edge of human perception, silent and ungraspable.